So my name is John Kiriakou. I was very fortunate, believe it or not, to have spent 15 years at the CIA, which I used to think was a really great thing. I rose through the ranks at the CIA quickly. Post 9/11, I was the chief of counterterrorism operations in Pakistan at the CIA station there. Tough job at a tough time. And a couple of months after arriving there, I led a series of raids that resulted in the capture of, I'm not allowed to say the number still, but many dozens of al-Qaeda fighters, including one by the name of Abu Zubaydah, who we believed wrongly at the time was the number 3 in al-Qaeda. Abu Zubaydah was not the number 3 in al-Qaeda. He actually had never even been a member of al-Qaeda. He cooperated with them. He was a bad guy, but he was not the number 3, and he certainly had nothing to do with 9/11. We didn't know that at the time. So we led this, we carried out a series of raids that resulted in his capture. I'm going to take a very long story and make it very, very short. He was shot and severely wounded by a Pakistani policeman that night. And so I escorted him to a Pakistani military base outside of Lahore and sat at his bedside for 56 hours. It was quite a long stretch of time, and we talked a lot. He cried a lot. He said he would never know the touch of a woman. He would never know the joy of fatherhood. And I said, "You're not the victim here. There were 50,000 people in those towers. What did you think was going to happen? Did you think we wouldn't try to find you or kill bin Laden?" And he said, "I had nothing to do with 9/11. He said, "I wanted to attack Israel. This was bin Laden's idea." We agreed to disagree. After a period of time, I told him, "Listen, I'm going to give you some advice. I am the nicest guy that you're going to meet in this experience. My colleagues are not nice like I am. So if there's one thing that you do, it's that you have to cooperate." And he said, "You seem like a nice man, but you're the enemy, and I'll never cooperate." I said, "Suit yourself." At the end of the 56 hours, the CIA sent in an unmarked private jet, and 3 FBI agents and I loaded him onto the plane. We tied him down to the luggage rack at the back of the plane, and I leaned over and I said, "Remember, you have to cooperate." And he squeezed my hand, and I never saw him again. I went back to CIA headquarters about 6 weeks later. And 2 days after I got home, I was in the cafeteria just to get lunch like everybody else, and a senior officer from the CIA's Counterterrorism Center stopped me very casually. And he said, "Hey, I'm glad I ran into you. Do you want to be certified in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques?" I had never heard that term before. This was May of 2002. So I said, "Enhanced interrogation techniques, what does that mean?" And very excitedly he said, "We're going to start getting rough with these guys." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And he explained to me these 10 techniques, culminating in waterboarding and sleep deprivation and something called the cold cell, which I'll get to in a minute. And I said, "Ooh, that sounds like a torture program." And he said, No, it's not torture. The president signed it. And the Justice Department said it wasn't torture." And I said, "I'm pretty sure that's torture." I declined to be trained. I'm sorry to say that of the 14 people who were approached, I was the only one who declined. And the reason that's difficult for me, even after all these years, is that many of the other 13 men who did go through the training and did carry out the torture were friends of mine. Our kids played together. We went on vacation together. We would have barbecues on the weekends. I liked these guys. I had no idea that they had it in them to carry something out like this. But because I refused the training, I was actually passed over for promotion. I just caught the guy that we thought was the number 3 in al-Qaeda, and I was passed over for promotion. And in my promotion panel, the director of the Counterterrorism Center said, and these were his exact words, that I had demonstrated a shocking lack of commitment to counterterrorism. I said, that's okay. So I ended up getting a field promotion, which is an out-of-cycle promotion, because there was a senior, very senior CIA officer in a position to promote me who also thought that this was a torture program, although he never said anything to anybody but me. So he promoted me. And because I got promoted, I moved on to be the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director. In that position, I was able to see literally everything that the CIA was doing. Literally. Cables were coming in from all over the world in these compartments that were classified in levels above top secret. And one of the things that I saw was the CIA began to torture Abu Zubaydah on August the 1st, 2002. Now, many of these techniques, and you were supposed to start at the basic, the bottommost technique, which is you grab him by the shirt and shake him and say, answer my questions. Well, that's not torture. But the other techniques clearly were. They moved on up to a smack in the belly, which makes a loud cracking sound and is humiliating, a smack in the face, a punch in the face, taking the guy and shoving him up against a wall. Now, the rules were clear. He had to have a rolled up towel around his neck to protect his neck and head, and the wall had to be made out of plywood so that there was a little give, but the wall was made of concrete, and they forgot to put the towel around his neck. And it wasn't just him. There were others, people like Ammar al-Baluch, the son-in-law of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was slammed against this concrete wall so many times that he has permanent brain damage and is unable to participate in his own defense. Of course, he's never going to go on trial anyway because they haven't afforded him that constitutional right. Anyway, Abu Zubaydah was a guinea pig for the CIA. He underwent terrible things that had not been approved by the Justice Department. The CIA was able to determine that he had an irrational fear of insects, for example. And so they put him in a coffin and they poured a box of cockroaches in with him. And they left him in there for 2 weeks, if you can imagine such a thing, just so that he would go insane. They chilled his room to 50 degrees Fahrenheit and stripped him naked. They chained him to an eye bolt in the ceiling so that he couldn't sit or lay down or get comfortable in any position. Left him there 24 hours a day, and then every hour a CIA officer would go in and throw a bucket of ice water on him. We murdered 2 people using that technique, that cold cell technique. Another was sleep deprivation, which I always believed was worse than waterboarding. Sleep deprivation is not what Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense, said it was, where you stay up for 48 hours and work. We know from the American Psychological Association that people begin to lose their minds at day 7 without sleep. They begin to die at day 9 without sleep. But the CIA was authorized to keep their prisoners awake for 12 days. And again, people really do lose their minds. And you end up with prisoners who are unable to participate in their own defenses. This bothered me greatly, and eventually I decided to resign from the CIA, and I waited for somebody to go public. Because, again, I'm reading all these cables coming back from the secret prison, and people are saying, this is wrong, I don't want any part of this, I'm going to curtail my assignment and return to headquarters, which is a career-ending move. 6 people did that. And I thought, well, thank God I'm not the only person who realizes that this is a war crime. Certainly somebody's going to say something. And nobody said a word. That was in 2002. I resigned in early 2004. Again, still waiting for somebody to say something. Finally, 5 years passed, 5.5 years, and I decided that I would say something. Human Rights Watch had come out with a report saying that the CIA was torturing prisoners. The Bush White House denied it. A year later, in 2006, Amnesty International said the same thing, and in early 2007, the International Committee of the Red Cross released a report saying the same thing. The CIA is torturing its prisoners. And those reports were met with denials, just black and white denials that any of that was happening. I decided to go on ABC News in Washington, and in a nationally televised interview, I said three things. I said that the CIA was indeed torturing its prisoners. I said that torture was official U.S. government policy. It was not the result of a rogue CIA officer like President Bush had said. He was lying, looking the American people in the eye and just lying. Third, I said that the torture program had been personally approved by the president. As you can imagine, the FBI began investigating me within 24 hours. The CIA filed something called a crimes report, saying that I had committed a crime by leaking classified information. But in the United States, we have a law saying that it's illegal to classify something that's a crime. If something is a crime, you can't classify it in order to keep it from the American people. And you also cannot classify something solely for the purpose of ensuring that the agency is not embarrassed. So just because something is embarrassing doesn't mean you can say it's a top secret program. The FBI investigated me for a full year from December of 2007 until December of 2008. And they determined in 2008 that I had not committed a crime. And they sent my attorneys what's called a declination letter saying that they were declining to prosecute. I actually took my wife to dinner that night. We were so happy. This terrible year-long nightmare was over. 3 weeks later, Barack Obama is inaugurated as president. The most transparent president in history, he said. I had no idea that he asked the Justice Department to secretly reopen the case against me. I had no idea that for the next 3 years, the Justice Department was intercepting my telephone calls, all of my emails, and there were 2 teams of FBI agents following me everywhere I went for the next 3 years. Finally, in January of 2012, I was arrested, and I was charged with 5 felonies, including 3 counts of espionage. Espionage is one of the gravest crimes with which an American can be charged. And in many cases, it carries with it the death penalty. So on the day of my arrest, and I was in shock that day, so I didn't react in any way. I couldn't. I met with the Justice Department along with my lawyers, and they offered me 45 years in prison. They said, if you take a plea, you do 45, and you might live to meet your grandchildren, Mr. Kiriakou. That's what the woman said to me. You might live to meet your grandchildren. I said, I'm not doing 45 minutes. Forget it. They came down later in the week to 10 years, and then to 8, and then to 5. My lead attorney, I had 11 attorneys, if you can imagine. Imagine what I still owe them. It'll make your hair stand up. He said to me, I've been an attorney for more than 50 years, and I've never seen them come down in time. Usually they'll come and they'll say 10 years. You say no, they come back next week with 15 years. With me, they kept coming down. I said, why would they do that? And he said, because they have a shit case and they know it's shit. We're going to trial. And so I set my mind to going to trial, not realizing that the deck was stacked. As recently as late 2012, I believed that there was justice in the U.S. justice system. Well, one of those 11 attorneys, the one who I liked and trusted the most, came to me one day and he said, best and final offer, 2.5 years. You'll be out in 23 months. And I said, no, I didn't do anything wrong. He got very angry and he said to me, you know what your problem is? Your problem is you think this is about justice. And it's not about justice. It's about mitigating damage. Take the deal. I realized that he was right. At the same time that the government was offering this deal, ProPublica, the famed investigative journalism website, came out with a study saying that the federal government wins 98.2% of its cases. 98.2%. Now, when I was at the CIA and Saddam Hussein was running for re-election and he got 98%, we laughed. We said the fix is in. What a joke. But the federal government wins 98% of its cases and we say, oh my God, they're all geniuses. What incredible attorneys. They only go after criminals because only a criminal would plead guilty, right? No. There's a joke in the States that everybody in prison is innocent. Well, guess what? I can tell you from firsthand experience, there are a lot of innocent people in prison. So my choice was take 2.5 years in prison or roll the dice knowing I have a 1.8% chance of winning. Besides that, my lawyers made 70 separate motions to declassify 70 documents necessary for me to defend myself. We blocked off 2 days for court hearings, and we went into the courtroom, and the judge said, I'm going to make this easy for everybody, and I am going to deny all 70 of these motions. My lawyers jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. She said, the objection's overruled. And she said to me, she looked at me and she said, Mr. Kiriakou, either you did it or you didn't do it. And you did it. Yeah, that's not justice. There's no affirmative defense in the United States. You can't say, yeah, I went on TV and I blew the whistle on the torture program because it's illegal and because the American people have a right to know what their government is doing in their name. That's not a defense. It ends with, did you do it? And I obviously, clearly did do it. And so, in her view, I was guilty. Now, this is the Eastern District of Virginia. We have district courts all over the country. The Eastern District of Virginia is known as the espionage court because no national security defendant has ever won a case there. I was tried there. Jeffrey Sterling, the CIA whistleblower, was tried there. Julian Assange is charged there. Ed Snowden has been charged in the Eastern District. I went so far as to hire O.J. Simpson's jury consultant, who has never lost a case and is not afraid of controversy. It turned out that my best friend's wife is his niece, so he did it for nothing. He came up from Dallas, Texas. We got him a security clearance. He went through all of the files. And finally we met with all the attorneys around this big conference room table. And he said, listen, if we were in any other district in America, I'd say, let's go for it. We can win this thing. But the Eastern District of Virginia, you don't have a prayer. He said, look at your jury. Your jury is going to be made up of people from the CIA, the FBI, the Defense Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and intelligence community contractors. You don't have a prayer. You're going to die in prison. Take the deal. And so that night, my wife and I sat at the dining room table with a calculator, and we tried to determine how long we could make it as a family if I were to go away to prison. And we figured with the generosity of friends and family, we could make it 2.5 years. And so finally I called and I said, I'll take the deal. What the Justice Department didn't bank on was that I would never shut my mouth. And so from prison, I began writing a blog, which caused me no end of trouble. Finally, the warden called me to his office and he said, I'm sending you to solitary. You got to stop writing this blog. He said, I can't figure out how you're getting it out. Well, this genius, I mean, all he had to do was ask me. I would have told him the truth. I was writing it and I was sending it to my lawyers because the only way you can get something out of prison and not have it intercepted is to put it in legal mail, which they're forbidden from opening. He said, you're smuggling it out. I know you're smuggling it out. Smuggling it out. I put a stamp on it and I mail it to my lawyer. So I said, listen, warden, all due respect, I have gone nose to nose with Al-Qaeda, with Hezbollah, with the Iranians, and I'm supposed to be afraid of you? Please, give me a little credit. I said, I've been in jail in Yemen, only for a day. But I said, I've been in jail in Yemen, and I'm supposed to be afraid of your solitary? Come on, I could stand to lose the weight anyway. And he backed off. But the bottom line is, and I promised I'd keep this short, that's the life of a whistleblower. Now, I'll admit to you that I didn't think this through beyond, the next 2 or 3 steps, because I naively believed that the American people had the right to know the truth, right? But how ridiculous that was. The government never wants the people to know the truth, never. And they'll go to extraordinary lengths to ensure that you don't know the truth. Has anybody ever heard of Aaron Swartz? He was one of the founders of Reddit. Yeah, right. And poor Aaron Schwartz was charged with a whole bunch of felonies for nothing, for sending somebody a link to an unclassified, website. He went home and he killed himself. And a reporter asked me, "Are you surprised that he killed himself?" And I said, "Oh, heavens, no. I'm surprised that more people don't kill themselves." It's the first thing that comes into your head. When they tell you, and how old was I? I was 48 years old when I was arrested. When they tell you 45 years in prison, and there's no federal parole in the U.S. If you're sentenced to 45 years, you're doing 45 years. You might get a little bit of time off, up to 15% for good behavior, but I'd be dead by then. So what's the alternative? Unless you're convinced that you can fight it successfully, which is incredibly difficult and expensive. I still owe my lawyers $880,000 that they will never see. So what do? You can't run away. They took your passport. You can't go to prison for 45 years. You'll die in there. What do? A lot of people decide, just end it. End it now. I didn't think that I would ever be arrested because I was right. And I was the good guy. At least I believed I was the good guy. Well, now I realize that the lesson here is that we all have to fight. It's the only way that we're going to change anything. We may not be successful in changing the laws themselves, but if we're loud enough and active enough, maybe we can change the way those laws are either interpreted or enforced. I'm going to close by saying something about the Espionage Act. This is a grave problem in the United States. The Espionage Act was written in 1917 to combat German saboteurs during the First World War. It's never been updated. It doesn't even mention the words classified information because the classification system hadn't even been invented yet. It was invented in the mid-1950s after the Rosenbergs were executed. Between 1917 and 2009, 3 Americans were charged with espionage for speaking to the media. In the 8 years of Barack Obama's presidency, 8 people were charged with espionage for speaking to the media. Almost 3 times the number of all American presidents combined, all previous presidents combined. I gave an interview to a South American newspaper a year ago, a little more than a year ago, in which I said I couldn't imagine any president being worse than Barack Obama in terms of attacking whistleblowers. I was crazy wrong, terribly wrong. We thought Obama was bad. Trump's just gotten started. And you can only blame Jeff Sessions for so long. Jeff Sessions isn't the Attorney General anymore. And now we're seeing real prison sentences. I got off with nothing compared to what people are getting now. People really are going to start dying in prison with these new sentences. And so the only fix is to change the Espionage Act, which is a lot easier said than done because what member of Congress is going to campaign on the notion of making it harder to charge somebody with espionage? You can't win votes that way. What district are you running in? I'm going to weaken the Espionage Act. You can't say that. And so there's no end in sight. The only fix really is to support people like Julian Assange and Ed Snowden and people who have literally put their lives on the line to change this system. For me, 2.5 years, actually, it went by in the blink of an eye. It felt like 2.5 decades when it was happening, but it passed in the blink of an eye. People like Julian and Ed and others that we don't even know about yet, like the Vault 7 whistleblower who was arrested a few months ago. Those are the guys that we need to support. Those are the people that we need to make the government aware that we're watching and we're concerned about. So I'll leave it at that. I think we still have, that was 30 minutes. Yeah, okay. 15 minutes we have. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
So did you get your passport back?
Eventually, I got my passport back. They took my passport in January of 2012. I asked for it back in 2015 and was told no. And so I filed a suit against the Marshals Service. And rather than argue the case, they just gave it back to me. I will say, when I was arrested, the Greek ambassador to the United States asked me how the Greek government could be helpful. And I said, how could you be helpful? You could give me citizenship. And they did. And I got a Greek passport. I never told the judge I had a Greek passport. But the Greeks were very, very good to me. Yes, sir.
Do you have any, I know you say in your past CIA, do you have any experience in psychological warfare or exotic weapons by any chance?
Some. The CIA doesn't really do exotic weapons. DARPA certainly does. That's where those weapons are developed. And a lot of them are experimental on the drawing board. I just read an article just in the last couple of days of a new kind of directed weapon that can kill somebody remotely in a car without breaking the windshield.
Yeah.
If you can imagine such a thing. I know that they've been experimenting on laser weapons that instead of killing people on the battlefield, blind them, which is actually a war crime. You can't do that. It's not illegal to kill them, but it is illegal to blind them. Psychological warfare is a big deal. They spend quite a lot of money on psychological warfare. 99% of those operations are just stupid wastes of money. Introducing National Public Radio to Yemen is not going to win hearts and minds. If you stop bombing them and starving them, maybe that might win some hearts and minds. But
it seems like there's a lot of psychological operations happening in the world currently.
Yes.
A lot of psyops, as people like to call them.
A lot of psyops.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money that's spent at the Pentagon on psyops. Now, whoever decided that the Pentagon would be good at such a thing, I have no idea. But they spend many millions of dollars on psychological operations around the world. And sometimes they're as silly as, when Saddam Hussein was still in power, we would just drop billions of dinars in counterfeit currency from airplanes to crash the economy. It didn't work, right? Or you hijack a television station and urge people to overthrow their government, or stupid stuff like that nothing ever works. Yes, sir.
Would you have done anything differently looking back?
Yes. Would I have done anything differently? Yes, indeed. I would have hired an attorney first. And this is what I urge all whistleblowers to do, or people who are thinking of becoming whistleblowers. Hire an attorney first. An attorney who's skilled in whistleblower defense. I was reactive. I was forced to be reactive because I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. And so I had to react to the government's accusations and charges once they were made. I wish I had consulted an attorney first who could have advised me on ways to say the things that I did that might have gotten me in less trouble.
Can I just follow up just really briefly?
Absolutely.
Just on that question, because you'll have attorneys who will be really trying to stop you. Most attorneys say,
good point.
This is not what you should do. So the point about getting an attorney is to get an attorney that actually is a public interest lawyer.
Good point.
Thinking through not only minimizing the risk to you, but understanding there's a risk and helping you maximize and advance the disclosure. So it's how you disclose that is a protection, not so much
Yes.
whether or not you disclose.
In the back, if you didn't hear the comment, it's to hire an attorney skilled in public interest law, because 99% of attorneys will try to talk you out of whistleblowing. Nothing good comes of it. You're going to lose everything. Everything, literally. I lost my job. I lost my security clearance. I lost my pension. I had $770,000 saved in my pension. 20 years of proud service, they just took it. I lost my house. I lost my wife. Literally everything. So they'll try to talk you out of it. If you engage with an attorney who's skilled in public interest law and who understands the value of the revelation that you want to make, then that's what you need. That's what you should look for. Yes, sir.
It's a change of question, but how badly has it tarnished your view of democracy?
Oh, How badly has it tarnished my view of democracy? I've concluded that the U.S. is not a democracy. We like to trick ourselves into thinking that we are. There's a lot about the United States that I've learned in the last 7 years or so. We like to convince other countries that we're this shining beacon of respect for human rights and civil liberties, and it's just simply not true. I'll give you an example. I was on rotation, on loan to the State Department for several years. And in a position like that, there really is a Chinese wall between you and the CIA. So I wasn't allowed to talk to anybody from the CIA. I wasn't allowed to have any contact. As a State Department officer, I was the human rights officer. And so I had to write the human rights report for this country every year. And you'd go to the Minister of Interior, as an example, and say, Your Excellency, you can't beat to death a 15-year-old because you don't like his politics. You can't do that. I have to report that to Congress, and they're going to cut off military sales to this country. You have to respect human rights. And then 15 minutes later, the CIA guy comes in, and he says, don't pay attention to that State Department guy. We want you to open a secret prison where we can bring prisoners and you can torture them for us and then give us a transcript of everything that they say, and we'll give you millions of dollars in aid secretly under the table. Well, what do you think they're going to do? You think they're going to listen to the State Department guy saying, this is wrong, you shouldn't do it? No, of course not. They laugh at you behind your back, and they do what the CIA tells them to do. So yeah, I have a very jaded view now of U.S. policy, of the justice system, which I tell you what, I was lucky because I was white, I was educated, and I had either access to money or to people who were willing to represent me for free. What do you do if you're black and you're poor? You don't have a prayer. You don't have a prayer, and you're going to die in there. And not just that. I was supposed to go to a minimum security work camp, and then just to screw me at the end, they upgraded me to a low-level prison, which is an actual honest-to-God prison with the guard towers and the guns and the double concertina wire. If you're black, you're going to the maximum security penitentiary. They're not going to put you in the low. So it's a bad situation. I learned a lot in there. A lot. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for that very gripping story, some of which I heard before. And, I had a question about Zubaida.
Yes.
So Zubaida, interesting case, obviously. I think it was the reason that I knew that he turned out not to be an Al-Qaeda was because he's one of the few guys, I think, that had a lawyer who submitted a habeas corpus petition, right?
Exactly right.
The U.S. admitted that, no, actually, we're not saying he was in Al-Qaeda, we're not saying he was involved in the Millennium Plots,
Right.
we're not saying he was involved in 9/11, and
Yep.
so, or the Taliban, or any of this stuff, that it was all the stuff that we've been told for years was not true. So, I guess my question is was that when you found out? Why does he have a lawyer and so many don't? And if I'm not wrong, is he still in Guantanamo right now?
He is still in Guantanamo. He'll likely be there for the rest of his life. We know from the Senate torture report that the CIA plan was to keep him there for life, and then once he died, to cremate him and throw his ashes into the ocean. So he'll likely be there for the rest of his life. They actually all have lawyers. All pro bono lawyers, and most of those lawyers are actually law professors, constitutional law professors. But the Defense Department simply will not allow them to meet their lawyers. So Abu Zubaydah was able to meet his for quite a while. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed met his for quite a while. The others met theirs for a little bit, and then all of a sudden they were denied access. So they've not been given the constitutional guarantees that everybody else has. And it's because the Obama Justice Department decided that as enemy combatants, this was the legal term that they've used, they're not entitled to constitutional protections. Now, that's, again, to me, that's completely illegal. We also have American citizens who were snatched overseas and sent to Guantanamo, and they are not allowed legal and constitutional protections. That's never been, to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't been argued before the Supreme Court. Maybe it has and they've lost and I didn't pay attention. I don't know, but it's just patently unfair. Regarding Abu Zubaydah, I wrote a book in 2016 with a fellow named Joe Hickman. Joe was a Guantanamo whistleblower who blew the whistle on a CIA officer who murdered 2 prisoners during an interrogation. He was never arrested or charged with a crime. But when we turned Abu Zubaydah over to the military, it was Joe that guarded him. So I had him until the secret prison, and then Joe took him from the secret prison to Guantanamo. We wrote a book together. And what we found in our research was that there were 2 Abu Zubaydahs, first cousins with the same name. So we didn't know that at the CIA, that there were 2. And so if you look at all the intelligence, this guy looks like a terrorist Superman. Like, how can this guy be in all these different places at the same time, doing all these different things? Well, he couldn't. There were 2 of them, and we got the wrong one. But the CIA is never going to admit a mistake like that. So they say, okay, he wasn't Al-Qaeda, he wasn't Taliban, but he was a trainer at the Al-Qaeda training camps, and he ran the House of Martyrs in Peshawar. Okay, fine. He's been in prison for 17 years. If you're not going to charge him with a crime, you have to let him go. And I'd say that the man has paid his debt to society, even if he was guilty. But they'll never let him go. They'll never let any of them go. Do we have any more time?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure whether we can have more questions at the moment. You can ask
After,
that
later.
question in the panel session at the end. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And now, Mr. Craig Murray. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would prefer not to sit down and use the mic, if you can hear me okay, not using it, and assuming the camera is getting the feed from this mic. And I'll probably move around a bit because my brain doesn't work unless my legs are moving. My brain sometimes doesn't work if my legs are moving, but without my legs moving, it definitely doesn't work. I have heard John's story before, but I'm always fascinated by the horror of it. There's so many things which run parallel with my own experience as a whistleblower, things which make it so hard to become a whistleblower. One of which I find emotionally most difficult is that the fact that the people who turn on you and turn against you are your friends and colleagues. I had worked in the Foreign Office for over 20 years when I left over the same issue, over complicity in torture. And I found that not only were my friends and colleagues involved in complicity in torture, most of them not liking it, but nobody prepared to lose their career over it. But some of them, people I knew, were prepared to turn against me and take an active part in my, not just my dismissal, but my potential prosecution. And discovering that the people, your milieu, the people you associate with, are not actually your friends is a very hard thing to do. John and I have a mutual friend, Ray McGovern, who is a very senior former CIA man who nowadays gives an awful lot of excellent talks and insights into what's wrong with the system. But Ray and I differ sometimes, in that whenever I talk, Ray says to me I should be more upbeat, because he says we should be encouraging whistleblowing. And he says if you tell people that whistleblowing is going to destroy your life, you're never going to work again, you're going to lose your family, you're going to lose all your money, you're going to have psychological problems and possibly commit suicide, nobody will want to whistleblow. And I see his point, but on the other hand, that is the honest truth. That is what happens to you when you whistleblow. And I would not want to encourage anybody to whistleblow, particularly if they come on a national security issue. I doubt, actually, it's an awful lot better even if you're whistleblowing in the private sector or in local government. I expect wherever you are whistleblowing, it's going to do you harm. Probably national security is the most extreme example, but the consequences are extreme. And the bias of the state against those who cross the state is also extreme, and the bias of the judicial system is extreme. When you were talking of the comments the judge made in your case, I was reminded of being at Julian Assange's court hearing a couple of weeks ago, where he was convicted of jumping bail. And what would we say if in Russia a dissident were dragged out and within 3 hours of being dragged out onto the street by police were actually convicted? We would be astonished. We would talk of Putin's dictatorship. If it happened in Venezuela to Guaido, who is still walking the streets despite having attempted to mount an armed coup, if he were arrested and convicted within 3 hours, we would say that was a terrible example of summary justice. If it happened in London, that's fine, apparently. And the judge, Judge Michael Snow, Julian had said nothing whatsoever except for not guilty at the time when the judge called him a narcissistic personality. And the judge had no because the judge was meant actually to be Judge Arbuthnot, who Julian's defence team objected to because she's married to a former Tory defence minister. So Judge Snow didn't know he was going to be the judge until immediately before. He cannot possibly, nothing had happened in that courtroom on which he could, other than the man said not guilty, on which he could have formed a reasonable judgment that this was a narcissistic personality. That had to be a prejudice that the judge had taken with him into that courtroom. And that says something about the impartiality of justice in the UK. I'm going to go back to my own story. After I left the Foreign Office, I wrote a book, Murder in Samarkand, in which I told the story of my whistleblowing. And I spent about 3 or 4 years of my life going around talking to audiences, telling them and lecturing on the subject. Of course, that was a long while ago. It all happened 15 years ago. And the last 10 years of my life, I've been going around speaking on other subjects. And it was only actually when I did an interview last week with Alex Salmond for his television show, when he was asking me about my past, my previous life, when I realized that because it was so long ago, many people don't know about it or have forgotten about it. And I've been going around assuming everyone knows all this stuff. So I am now going to talk about my own whistleblowing experience. If you have read Murder in Samarkand, you'll probably get very bored because you'll have heard it all before. Because I think there's some points which relate very strongly to what John said, and there also I want to then mix that in with questions of how the media treat whistleblowers and how society treats whistleblowers. I was a British diplomat. I was in the British Foreign Service from 1984 till 2005. I'd had a very successful career to the extent that I think at the age of 42 I became Britain's youngest ambassador. I was posted to Uzbekistan, and that wasn't as obscure as it sounded because it borders Afghanistan to the north, and we were engaged in an active war in Afghanistan at the time of my appointment. In Uzbekistan, I was briefed quite strongly by the Foreign Office that my task was essentially to support the regime and to support the Americans, who had a large military base in the country, and that this was a very important centre for the war on terror. I very soon discovered that the dictatorship was an appalling dictatorship, which practiced the very worst forms of torture, things even worse than the ones which the CIA were doing directly. And I mean very basic and unsubtle forms of torture, like ripping out people's fingernails, mutilating their genitals, raping people with objects. And in one extreme incident I came across, boiling people alive. We received photos in the embassy of a corpse taken by the mother of the victim. And from the photographs, I'd never seen anything like it. And I couldn't quite work out what had happened. I sent the photos back to the Human Rights Policy Department of the Foreign Office. And they sent them on to the University of Glasgow Pathology Department, who prepared a report in which they said that the man had been boiled to death. And it was immersion in boiling liquid, not splashing. So there was a clear tide line around the upper torso and upper limbs. And I was meeting victims of, once it became obvious I was taking an interest in human rights, which frankly no other Western ambassador was doing, people started flocking to me. Victims of the regime started flocking to me. And I started hearing evidence of what people were being forced to say under torture. And people were being tortured in order to make them confess to membership of Al-Qaeda. And the reason that the Uzbeks wanted people to confess to membership of Al-Qaeda was twofold. The first was they wanted any opposition. It's not a democracy. Any opposition they wanted to label as Al-Qaeda as opposed to democratic opposition. And the second one was they were getting hundreds of millions of dollars in aid and military aid from the Americans as part of the fight against Al-Qaeda. So they had to manufacture Al-Qaeda to fight against. And the Americans, of course, were happy to go along with charade because the Americans wanted Uzbekistan for the military base which serviced operations in Afghanistan. So all the material from the torture chambers was going to the CIA. And the CIA, as part of their routine intelligence sharing, was sharing it with MI6. We didn't actually have an MI6 station in Tashkent. Everywhere else I'd served, there had always been an MI6 station. There wasn't one in the embassy in Tashkent, and this is going to spoil James Bond for you forever. There wasn't an MI6 station in Tashkent because MI6's health and safety people said Tashkent was too dangerous. Absolutely true. So I didn't have my own MI6 station, but I received all the stuff from the CIA, actually via London, weirdly enough. The CIA would report back to Washington. They would issue reports which were then simultaneously issued to London, and London would send it back to me. So with a 24-hour delay, I would get what the CIA had issued in Tashkent. And it became very plain to me that what the CIA was retailing, all these CIA reports were about Al-Qaeda, people confessing to membership of Al-Qaeda and giving details of other members of Al-Qaeda. And a lot of it was plainly nonsense, because I was there on the ground and I knew a lot of the people involved, and I knew they weren't in Al-Qaeda. My favorite example I always give is that there was a CIA report saying that a professor in Tashkent was a member of Al-Qaeda, and I knew the man. I'd actually been to dinner with him, and he was a Jehovah's Witness. There are not many Jehovah's Witnesses in Al-Qaeda. So we were obtaining this report, this material, and I was obviously horrified at the torture that was happening. I was horrified at the extent of our cooperation with the Uzbek security services, who are amongst the most. Many regimes have terribly brutal security services, but these are as bad as any. And I was concerned about legality, because under the UN Convention Against Torture, I think Article 4, complicity in torture is illegal. And it seemed to me that if you are regularly obtaining intelligence from the torture sessions, that makes you complicit. And I was trying to think how to stop this and what argument ministers in London might listen to. So the argument on which I focused was that ministers in London in receiving this material on a regular basis were putting themselves in the position of acting illegally. And I sent back a telegram, as we call it. In America, they call them cables. We call them telegrams in our Foreign Service. I sent back a formal diplomatic communication addressed to Jack Straw personally, marked top secret, I wasn't blowing a whistle, internal, to the Foreign Office in November or December of 2002, saying we're obtaining this material from torture, this is illegal, it's immoral, and it's impractical because under torture, you don't get the truth, you get what the torturer wants to hear, and that's often a very different thing. I didn't get any reply from the Foreign Office, which is very unusual. I mean, if an ambassador writes on a policy matter, you always get a reply of some kind. I got no reply. I wrote again in February of 2003, and I received a phone call asking me to come back to London for a meeting. That didn't happen very often when you're in Tashkent. People often phone up and say, can you come back to London for a meeting? So I flew back to London, and actually I was expecting to get sacked as I flew back. I thought, that's the end of my glittering career, I'm going to be sacked. I went into the meeting, which was chaired by a lady called Linda Duffield, who was the director for wider Europe in the Foreign Office. It must have been very wide, because it included Tashkent. And Michael Wood, Sir Michael Wood, the Foreign Office's chief legal advisor, was in the meeting. A guy called Matthew Kidd, representing MI6. And the first thing I was told, which I was told very sternly, was that Jack Straw was not happy with me at all, because this whole question of getting intelligence from torture should never be committed to writing. I should not have put this in writing. And then I was told that the policy was that we would get intelligence from torture in the war on terror. And then Sir Michael Wood was asked to clarify the legal position to me, and Sir Michael Wood said that it was legal to get intelligence from torture in terms of the UN Convention Against Torture, so long as we neither did the torturing nor specifically requested that somebody was tortured. But if it was folks were torturing people off their own initiative and giving us the intelligence, we were not acting illegally in his view, because he said, and I understand there are some lawyers here, because he said, in legal parlance, the word complicit is opaque. He said, there you are. Word complicit never seemed that opaque to me, but it was opaque to Sir Michael. And I should say, I didn't know at the time. I have to say two things. One thing, Michael Wood is somebody with whom I had on several occasions in my past life been outrageously drunk, including one time at the United Nations meeting in New York when he was our legal counselor in New York, when 2 New York policemen had to carry me back to his flat because I was so drunk I couldn't walk. So Michael was a friend of mine, and I was quite surprised he wasn't supporting me in the meeting. The other thing I didn't know, and I only found out during the Chilcot inquiry, was that the day before he had refused to Jack Straw's face to agree that the invasion of Iraq would be legal, and Jack Straw had written to the Attorney General asking the Attorney General to remove him as Chief Legal Officer. So obviously Michael was under a huge pressure himself. And I say, but the man was my friend, so I feel I should justify his lack of... he wasn't in the strongest position himself to be backing me at that moment. Anyway, I went back to Tashkent and I thought, this is not good. I didn't know what to do. We were obtaining intelligence from torture. I'd been told this was legal and it was a policy. I didn't think I could go along with it. And I really didn't know what to do. On top of which, I met the Tashkent. There are not many Westerners living in Tashkent. And there were about 2 bars that Westerners who lived in Tashkent used to drink in. and that I used to meet people from the American embassy, and I used to meet the people who were not actually from the CIA, they were contractors from a company called, I think, Premier Executive, John might know better than me, who were flying in the people being rendered to Uzbekistan in order for them to be tortured. And I discovered that was happening. I didn't realize, and I never asked, I assumed the people they were flying into Uzbekistan in order for them to be tortured were Uzbek nationals. They were returning home. I didn't realize actually they were third country nationals. I only found that out subsequently. I'd made the incorrect presumption they must be Uzbek nationals because anything else would be completely illegal. And I was still a bit naive at that stage about the extent to which the British and American governments were acting illegally. Anyway, I sort of pushed the boundaries. I cleared a speech through Whitehall attacking the human rights abuses in Uzbekistan, which nobody could stop me making, because officially that's our policy, but which they were very unhappy about me making. I then went on holiday to Canada in the summer of 2003, and I was called back from a family holiday. And I was called into the personnel department of the Foreign Office, and I thought, oh, now they are going to sack me. And there was a gentleman, his name was Howard Drake, who was the personnel manager. And in the Foreign Office at that time, personnel was just another posting. It wasn't a professional service. You know, I could have been in the personnel department. It's just another posting you could be given as you moved around the world. And Howard Drake was somebody I had taken over from Howard as head of the Cyprus section a few years ago. And when you'd change jobs in the Foreign Office, you hot desk. We'd sit at the same desk for a week doing a handover, doing the same job together. So I knew him quite well. And he said to me, Craig, everyone in the office is concerned about you because you're having a lot of policy disagreements about Tashkent. Don't you think it would be better for everyone if you just leave Tashkent? And I said, well, possibly, waiting to see what he would say. And he said, well, Copenhagen is coming up. We need a new ambassador in Copenhagen. Copenhagen's a nice place, got the Tivoli Gardens, and you're not going to be in the kind of policy hotspot you are in Tashkent. He said, and it's more money. And I said, well, can I have a couple of days to think about it? And he said, well, you can, but I do have to tell you this. In your absence on holiday, we sent somebody to Tashkent to investigate what's been going on, and he's come up with these 18 allegations against you. And he literally opened a drawer of his desk and placed a sheet of paper in front of me. And it said, number one, that I'd been issuing visas in exchange for sex. Number two, that I was a habitual alcoholic. Number three, that I'd driven an office vehicle down a flight of steps. And I did say to him, you do know I can't drive. I've never driven a vehicle anywhere in my life. And 18 of them. 18 of them. Every single one of them was untrue. And they were quite astonishing. We'd had a touring folk band as part of the cultural program come out. And they had come with their PA equipment, and to ship it back to the UK again, the PA equipment would have cost £2,000 or something. So I had bought the PA equipment for £2,500 to keep there for next time, as opposed to paying £2,000 to ship it back. And the allegation was that that was a corrupt deal, because the PA hire company was on the same street that my father was born on in Edinburgh. And obviously they'd researched this. You know, they must, how much of a tooth comb? I swear to you, I did not know on which street in Edinburgh my father had been born. How much of a tooth comb did they have to go through my affairs in order to find that correlation, that I had bought a PA with public money of a company based in the same street where my father was born? So the weird thing, these allegations were such a strange combination. The sex for visas allegation named one woman, and there was only one woman. It said there were many, but there was a specimen example given, if you like, and it was somebody I'd never met in my life. I'd never heard their name before. It was quite astonishing. But on her visa application form, someone had written, authorized by ambassador. And there was a letter from her sponsor, who was her boyfriend, saying the circumstances are known by Craig Murray. And I didn't know him either. I'd never met him in my life. Years later, I got an investigative reporter from the Sunday Times, a guy called Bob Graham, came to interview me, and I told him about it. I gave him the papers. He went and found this man, whose name was Dermot Hassett. He went and found him in Ireland and asked him about it. And Dermot Hassett told Bob Graham, and I'm sorry, I can't prove this. Dermot Hassett told Bob Graham that he had been visited by, when he was putting in the visa application for his girlfriend to come to the UK, he had been visited by somebody from the embassy who had advised him that if he wrote that I knew about it, that would help him get the visa. And obviously it had been an attempt to set me up, but behind my back. All of which was horrifying. I think I was just meant to cave. I think they thought I would. It's almost a bit like the American system. Now I think they just thought this was also horrifying. I would roll and I would resign. And I think they certainly thought this was also horrifying, that I would choose Copenhagen over having all this rubbish raked through. Of course, they'd misread me totally. I mean, I will never know, to this day, I will never know how I would have reacted if they hadn't done that. If they just said, why don't you give up and go to Copenhagen, it's more money, I might have accepted. I don't know. I'd like to think I wouldn't, but I might have. But the moment they tried to blackmail me, there was no way I was going to accept. I was going to fight them till the day I die, and I'm still fighting them now, in effect. That's why I'm here. But just the crassness of it. And but the point I want to make to you is I had not, at that stage, blown the whistle. I had been fighting against the intelligence from torture purely internally. I had not spoken to a single I'd spoken about the human rights abuses in Uzbekistan. I had not spoken to a single journalist about it. I had not leaked anything. Everything I'd written on the subject had been marked top secret and sent through top secret channels. But after they tried to blackmail me, that's when the gloves came off and I went public. I went public on the torture and extraordinary rendition, and also I fought the allegations against me. And I was probably, in a sense, I was fortunate in that because they'd made the allegations against me, I did get a lawyer at the same time that I went public on and whistleblew. And I was even more fortunate in that the lawyer I got was Gareth Pearce, who is possibly the greatest human rights lawyer in the world. And Gareth, I think Gareth scared the Foreign Office away from the allegations. They then threatened to prosecute me under the Official Secrets Act. Again and again and again, but they never did. They backed away from that too, and I think that was very much. Well, in fact, I know from subsequent Freedom of Information requests that in the internal discussion they referenced Clive Ponting, because Clive Ponting, of course, was the whistleblower in the Falklands War who blew the whistle that the British knew the Belgrano was steaming away from the Falklands at the time they sunk it. And he was prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act, and despite the fact he was obviously guilty in terms of the act, he was found not guilty because the jury refused to convict. And if they had tried me under the Official Secrets Act, I would have had a jury, and their reading was a jury would refuse to convict even though I'm guilty, because we don't have a district of West Virginia where you could do it, where you could get a packed jury of that kind. You just wouldn't find 12 people willing to convict someone for blowing the whistle on torture. That's why I'm still a free man, and that's why I didn't go to jail. But they kill you off in other ways. And obviously my career in the Foreign Office was over. And I went to look for other employment. And I had had a very successful career in the Foreign Office and worked, particularly in Africa. I'd worked a lot on African development. I'd worked a lot on conflict resolution. I'd worked a lot on human rights. I had a tremendous CV. And I thought I will have no difficulty getting employment in Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or in Oxfam or Save the Children or somewhere. And I found doors just shut in my face everywhere I went. And of course, what I hadn't realized, naively, which I now know, is that the so-called third sector nowadays is almost entirely dependent on government funding for its operations. Anything like Save the Children or Oxfam or whatever probably gets 90% of its funds for administering and running government programs. Not to mention the fact that chief executives of these things are paid £300,000 a year and they operate more like corporations than like charities. I was naive about the ability to shut those doors in my face. And I was certainly naive about the campaign of sort of mainstream media hatred that I would encounter for the rest of my life and still do encounter. And it's quite interesting because because of inside knowledge, I have inside knowledge of a lot of things which government do, and particularly with an ambassador, you cooperate very closely with the security services over many years. I know an awful lot about the things the government do, which most people don't want to admit to themselves. I think here the concept of cognitive dissonance is very important. Most people want to avoid cognitive dissonance. You don't want to believe things that upset your world view. Whereas I've seen enough to realize that Western governments often do very bad things. And I've certainly seen enough not to have this naive view that we are the goodies and the Russians and the Chinese are the baddies. The world isn't like that. And so when, for example, when I saw what happened with the Skripals, I was immediately suspicious of the British government narrative, and I still am suspicious of the British government narrative, because there are too many holes that don't add up. That does not mean I believe the Russian government narrative. I do not believe their narrative either. But I know that governments play dirty games against each other. But what I do find is that I am constantly, because I am prepared to say things which go against the mainstream media narrative, if you like, sit outside the Overton window, I get continually maligned, and I get accused of believing in things that I don't believe in at all. And don't get me wrong, I'm not maligning people who do believe in these things. It happens I don't believe in them. I'm not, and never have been, a 9/11 conspiracy theorist. I broadly accept the established view of what happened at 9/11. I have certainly not and have never been a Holocaust denier. And I do not believe either Freemasons or Jewish bankers run the world. And I don't believe the royal family are lizards. But I am, on a regular basis, accused of believing all of those things by members, senior members, of the mainstream media. And here I'm talking of, David Aronovich, Hadley Freeman, Nick Cohen, the liberal intelligentsia of The Guardian in particular, but the Murdoch press. Whenever I say anything that contradicts any official narrative, then you're immediately derided as a conspiracy theorist who believes all kinds of matters. Of course, he wouldn't accept the British government's view, of what happened in the Skripal case because he believes in lizards, or he doesn't believe in 9/11, or this kind of you become a non-person. This kind of diminishing narrative is very hard to live with. I am reasonably close to Julian Assange and to WikiLeaks, and am known to be. And certainly I'm in a much better position to speak with authority on the subject than a great many commentators. When Julian was arrested, within 2 hours of his arrest, I had phone calls from BBC One, BBC Two, BBC World, Sky News, ITN, all booking interviews with me for that afternoon. About 2 hours later, within a 15-minute period, all of them phoned up and cancelled me. And that happens on quite a regular basis. And that's part of being, if you are a whistleblower who can speak with some authority in contradicting official narratives, you have to be non-personed. And you are non-personed on a regular basis. So you are either ignored and blacklisted, or you are derided. And that is the extent of your contact with the mainstream media. Which is, of course, why alternative media becomes the outlet for whistleblowers. And I want to talk about the Panama Papers as an example. I think the Panama Papers, if you recall that, was very interesting because when they released those records from the legal firm, was it Fonseca, the legal firm in Panama, those were released through mainstream media. They were given to the Institute of Investigative Journalists, or whatever they call themselves. And that was quite extraordinary because despite repeated promises, the full unredacted papers have never been published. We were told they will be, they will be, they will be. They never have been. Not 10% of them have ever been published. And if you remember, on day one, the first day of publication, the front page of The Guardian and of The Times and of most papers around the world was that the Panama Papers showed that a Russian chap who plays the cello, who is related to Vladimir Putin's chef, had $3 million in a bank account. And that was the front page of The Guardian. Not one senior, there was one little dodgy guy who sold cars, I think, in Kent, who was revealed as having $250,000 in Panama. Not one senior British or American figure was ever outed in the Panama Papers. Now, there may be people here who believe that's because not one senior British or American figure had any money among all these billions stashed in Panama. Or it may be that actually putting it all straight onto alternative media through WikiLeaks would have been a damn sight better than putting it through the mainstream media. And we live in a world now where there is growing skepticism of the mainstream media, which I think is justified. I think the Overton window is narrowing. And we live in a world of disconnect between the increasingly linked political and media elite, all of which is to do with concentration of media ownership, and what people believe. And all that feeds further into the climate that gives us the rise of political populism, some of which is understandable and some of which is highly undesirable, and of disconnect from the political class. And I think whistleblowing has played a key element in that. I think WikiLeaks and what WikiLeaks has revealed has done a great deal to increase people's distrust in government. And I think distrust in government is the correct stance. I think people should be skeptical of government. I discovered I'm actually in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations. And I'm in there saying, if the government wants you to know something, then it probably isn't true. Which I can't remember ever saying, but it sounds it sounds very wise. Whoever did say it, thank you. But we live in a world where I don't think whistleblowers can trust the mainstream media. I think the mainstream media is essentially hostile to whistleblowing and to whistleblowers. And I think there's a great deal in the Panama Papers. I still think there's much of what Snowden revealed, which hasn't found its way through mainstream media filters into the public domain yet. And my advice to whistleblowers in future is this. Firstly, get out. When I blew the whistle, I got out everything I knew in one go, holding nothing back, so they had no incentive to kill me. And that is a good thing. Get everything out at once. Get it out through the internet. Do not trust the mainstream media with your secret, because they will have somebody somewhere in the establishment they wish to protect, and they will hold back and they will distort what you say. But do realize that if you blow the whistle, you're doing it as a matter of moral principle, and it is going to bugger up your life. Thank you very much indeed.
I think really just a general comment and an observation, and I'm not sure if it'll turn into a question. I've met a lot of whistleblowers, and I'm a whistleblower myself, and the one thing I've never met is a whistleblower that thought one day I'm going to do this because I'm going to make a lot of money, I'm going to become very famous, and I'm going to make a career out of it, and that's the reason I'm going to whistleblow. Every whistleblower I've met, regardless of what it's on, be it banks, children or anything, have done it because they morally think something's right, somebody's getting a bad deal or somebody's been harmed. And I suppose if I ask a question is, where do we go from here? So I whistleblow on the Rotherham child abuse scandal. And I sit here and I think, why has that caused so much trouble that I've been arrested, I've been threatened with prison, you know, and 3-4 years on, that is continuing. So what do we do? Where do we go? You know, do we have an uprising? I don't know, because if you can whistleblow on something like I did and they still don't leave you alone, where do you go? And I don't know if you can answer that, but it's just, would I do it again? Yes. Would I do it differently? Absolutely. Would I protect my family? Definitely. But people like me still need to be standing up to governments and local authorities when we know that our children are being tortured and abused in the way that they were in Rotherham. So I don't know, I suppose my question is, what do we do? Because I've never met a happy whistleblower.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right in that whistleblowing is, you know, a thing of principle. It's a thing people do to protect others. I also don't know whistleblower, as you say, who blew the whistle for their own advantage. It's not why people do it. There are more organisations now which exist to protect whistleblowers, and there's new legislation from the European Union which is coming in. Whether that will in the real world have any effect, any of that, to be honest, I'm slightly sceptical. Which is probably not the officially approved answer, but the because the problem, you know, the mechanisms which impact whistleblowers are societal, and they're about the organisations in which people work, and the fact that those organisations acquire an institutional personality of themselves, and the people who work within them want to protect that institutional organisation from attack, and they do that by attacking the dissident. And that's something which I think whistleblowers are always going to face. Until you've done it, you don't realise the societal hostility that's going to ensue. And it's very, very hard to cope with. And you're right, and the impact on families is something which John mentioned, that he'd lost his family. I ended up divorced, and the strain on families is extreme. There is more awareness of this, and as I say, there are a number of well-meaning whistleblower support organisations which do exist. Whether in the real world that makes much difference, I somewhat doubt. You know, I'm sorry to say it, but I think whistleblowing is a martyr's crown. It's going to hurt. It's going to hurt. Is it gentleman sideways? Yep. You can't see him.
So you mentioned about the mainstream media, and I think a lot of people look at the media as a single entity as opposed to hundreds, if not thousands, of people working individually pursuing slightly different incentives. So could you provide a definition for the mainstream media and what sets it apart from, to use your phrase, the alternative media?
I think corporate ownership is essentially the difference. Corporate or state ownership. I mean, the question of the herd psychology of how it works and how people tell people don't have the owner. Even people who work for the Times don't have Rupert Murdoch come down and tell them what to write. That's not how it works. You pick up from those around you the sort of thing that you write that's going to advance your career, and it's an unconscious mechanism. But also, a bit like supporting a football team. When you're in an institution, institutional loyalty also works as a force in bringing people into a common view. It's been fascinating. I've been particularly fascinated as a former Guardian reader in watching the right wing drift. Well, it's not the right wing drift. The right wing frenzied gallop of the Guardian over the last 5 years has been quite astonishing to see, till it's now a full-on neocon newspaper tempered with identity politics, which so the print version of Hillary Clinton.
Andrew?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have a question for both of you. You can choose to answer both of you. This is about, so you have some sort of institutional support, your little whistleblower organizations which have come up now. But in your own experience, what has been the reaction of common people who generally knew when you came out, when you blew the whistle? And what was not your immediate family members, but people around you, not the people you worked in the intelligence for that matter, for them to band against you in the national interest is kind of pretty understandable for their own career concerns and all that. But other people who knew, what was their reaction in personal relationships?
It was mixed. I think this is on. Is it on? No. It was mixed. 70 CIA officers signed a letter to the president asking him to commute my sentence. So that was nice. I got a private email from a retired deputy director of the CIA, number 2 in the CIA, saying, "You've chosen a difficult road. I'm glad that you did. I wish I had the guts to do it." Made me feel great. With that said, I had friends who stopped speaking to me and never spoke to me again. Good friends, long-term friends. I had family members who cut me off, saying that I had brought shame on the family for getting arrested. This is a cousin who actually had a drug arrest in his past. I brought shame on the family. But it also opened up a new world to me. People that I otherwise would never have become acquainted with, who've become very dear friends. I would have never met these gentlemen here on this panel, never. I would have never had access to people like that. And so, in a situation like this, when you blow the whistle on something, you realize who your true friends are. And for those who weren't true friends, you're better off without them anyway. That's been my conclusion.
No, I keep making downbeat points about human nature, but and one of the things that fascinated me was that people who were at the top of the Foreign Office, the most senior people, the Jeremy Greenstocks and Christopher Myers and those people, remained my friends and are still my friends today, because they had nothing to lose. They had reached the top of the Foreign Office. It was the people striving still in the rat race to get promoted all decided they should never ever speak to me again and should be extremely rude about me. And that in itself is a fairly sort of horrible observation about human nature. It really did seem to depend how secure people felt in their own position, whether they felt able to express sympathy or friendship. More widely, I don't think I lost any personal friends who were not in the Foreign Office. And my family were all delighted because they're all Scottish nationalists, and my family all thought I was a terrible traitor being in the Foreign Office in the first place. So that worked fairly well.
If I may say one thing, this hasn't been discussed yet, it'll be my turn shortly. For the people who help whistleblowers, who become their shields, including the lawyers, John's observations equally apply to those people. John's observations about how he was treated by friends, his employers, family, people in the community, these are the same things that happen to people who help whistleblowers, like the Snowden refugees, the lawyers who fight for whistleblowers. There's a very heavy price to pay, and I'll go into that later.
So if you're giving advice to whistleblowers of the future, would you give advice now to say, because of all the trauma it causes whistleblowers, being a whistleblower, being excluded, losing your friends, things like that, and facing jail, to actually stay inside the organisation and leak?
There's an argument to be made for staying inside the organization. I wouldn't recommend it. You know, I read a psychological study several years ago that was fascinating, and it said that whistleblowers have an unusually clearly defined sense of right and wrong. That for whistleblowers, many issues are black and white without there being a gray area in the middle. And so if you just can't live with the status quo and you feel compelled to say something, by all means say it, but say it knowing what the consequences are going to be. You can't trick yourself into thinking that everything is going to be fine, or you're going to be famous, or you're going to be rich. You're not. Daniel Ellsberg told me that when he blew the whistle on the Vietnam War by leaking the Pentagon Papers, his very wealthy in-laws cut him off like a bad habit. And they wrote his wife out of their will. They left millions and millions of dollars to her brother. They didn't leave a cent to Dan Ellsberg and his wife. And he told me that he has been broke since 1970. There's a wonderful book called Beautiful Souls by A.L. Press. And he does a psychological study on 4 different modern whistleblowers. Mostly Western, I don't know why that turned off, mostly Western Europeans. And he concludes also that whistleblowers all die broke. That's just a fact of life for whistleblowers, or dead. Yeah, oh thanks. You die broke. And I think it was Craig that said too, there's a psychological price that comes with this too. I'm sure that you could tell us about post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, not being able to sleep at night, anxiety, depression. It all comes with whistleblowing. So before you say anything, make sure that your ducks are in order and make sure that this is really something that you want to do, or more importantly, something that you need to do. That your sense of right and wrong dictates that you go public. Thanks for this.
Okay, one last question.
Just very, very quickly. I'm a professor at business school, so I want to speak from that perspective, and I work with you, with my colleague Kate, with you guys, and thank you again.
Thank you.
What I want to say that there is a bigger thing happening here, and I think the thing is that how you are discredited. There are so many issues which I don't want to repeat, but one thing I want to emphasize, how you are discredited, so your own standing, yes. But that is a bigger project in that, and people who help whistleblowers as well, 100%, because the information must not get out in a sense of it being legitimized. So I think there is something very important
Good
in
point.
that. And that's why the attack is so vicious, and that's why it's so sustained, and that's why. So that's a very important aspect of this, actually, why a whistleblower has to be, made a non-person or killed socially.
Yes.
If not killed literally.
Oh, so true, so true. One of the things, when I blew the whistle on the torture program, the CIA never, ever came out and said, he's lying, we didn't torture anybody. They never said that. what they said is, oh, he was no good. He was a failed officer. And then I showed them my 12 Exceptional Performance Awards, my Sustained Superior Performance Award, my Meritorious Honor Medal for bravery in, danger zone. And then they said, well, he has some kind of a psychological problem. He can't keep his mouth shut. Well, which one is it? I'm a lousy employee. I have a psychological problem. They couldn't attack the message, so they attacked the messenger. And that's not unique to John Kiriakou. That happens with every whistleblower. Oh, Ed Snowden, he's a Russian agent. I can't tell you how many times I've had to say to people, are you out of your mind? The man was in the transit lounge at Moscow airport, and John Kerry canceled his passport. John Kerry is the reason that Ed Snowden is in Moscow today. He's not a Russian agent. That's what the American government wants you to believe. And they do that with every whistleblower.
There is, by the way, in the media a fear of whistleblowers to the extent that if you're going to blow, if the media, where I've worked all my life, encourages whistleblowing, then the problem is that people will blow whistles inside the media. There's a corporate fear of internal dissent, and like any large corporations, they say we the media encourage dissent, and yet we don't encourage it within our own ranks, where people will lose their jobs and lose their livelihoods and be overseen for promotion and things like that. So it's a two-sided business, and the point you made about whistleblowing, not being concerned about going to the mainstream media, is you're quite right to be concerned about that, because the first question you're asked about a whistleblower is, what's their motivation? Mm-hmm. And my first question as a journalist, not a manager, is, what does the document say? Mm-hmm. And that's the difference. And so this is the sort of struggle that goes on inside the media as well. Just thought I'd add that.
Absolutely right.
I'm afraid we're going to have to...
I wanted to mention one thing in relation to that. I just want to mention one thing in relation to that. I used to be a teacher. I was bullied at work. I wrote about it for the Times Education Supplement. The amount of abuse I got from fellow teachers was astonishing. And the vast majority of colleagues that I had will not speak to me ever again.
Yep.
Now, now I have a PowerPoint presentation here, and some of the slides I'll go through very briefly. But what I wanted to do today was, I'm happy to talk about the experiences I've had and those who have helped my clients, Edward Snowden in particular, the consequences they've suffered. But I also would like to go through some academic material, because I feel that whether it's the general population, the media, civil servants, there's really a lack of education in terms of constitutional law and international law. So what I'll do, so as you're aware, I act for Edward Snowden. I still act for him today. And I also am the lawyer for the Snowden refugees. Now let's see if this works. There we go. So briefly, if I could encapsulate this, Ed had arrived in Hong Kong in just around the latter part of May 2013. And on June 10th, he had made his disclosures in an interview with Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, and he had exposed his identity at that time. And everybody in Hong Kong was aware there was a former CIA agent making these disclosures. And in the morning of the 10th of June, I received a phone call very, very early in the morning, and it was a call for help. And I turned on my communications, and here's Ed Snowden. This is the man. And it was crucial that I get to Mr. Snowden as soon as possible. It's crucial that a lawyer gets to somebody in Ed's position immediately before anyone else can get to him. If the authorities had gotten to him, Ed would have been compromised. If the US government had gotten to him, it was very clear to me, it was crystal clear that he'd disappear. There was almost a certain risk he'd be extraordinarily renditioned. He'd disappear from Hong Kong. So at that time, it was a simple series of tasks. One was to get Ed out of the Mira Hotel. Second was to get him to the UNHCR to create a legal barrier to protect him. Once he raised his claims with the UNHCR, he would not be able to be removed from Hong Kong, pursuant to any extradition request. And it would be politically difficult for the United States government to send some of their officers from the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong to find Ed and then just remove him. But still, that wasn't, out of the possibilities. The third thing that had to be done for Ed was to put him underground, because even with his claims raised with the UNHCR in Hong Kong, again, anything could happen to him. He could be killed. There was evidence that his life was at risk, and clearly he could disappear. So what I had done is I had advised Ed, look, you've raised your claims with the UNHCR, your refugee claims. I think you're best placed in the refugee community, because these are people in the same social group as you, because now you're part of that community. And there are advantages in that the refugee community in Hong Kong is so marginalized, isolated from mainstream society, that they're ignored. They're Hong Kong's version of untouchables. Nobody looks at this community. So I specifically chose 3 families in the middle of Hong Kong, because my strategy was to put him in plain sight. Nobody would expect to see Ed Snowden hanging out in the middle of Hong Kong. And to put him in buildings where these are old, dilapidated buildings, no elevators, no CCTV cameras, and so to put him in those buildings. And then the third consideration was which refugee families could provide him the humanity, compassion, empathy, and basically provide him with a safe haven, a place of refuge within Hong Kong. As on the Monday, June 10th, a storm was descending on Hong Kong. The whole world was looking for Ed Snowden, from the media to the US government, and this was the world's largest manhunt in action. And it all happened like that. It's not like Ed called up a lawyer a few weeks earlier. It was talk to the journalists, film Ed, show it on television, show it through the media, and ask Ed Snowden what he wants to do next. Okay, so it was a very difficult set of circumstances. So Ed stayed safely with the 3 families, and the information we received from the Hong Kong government, and what we understood is the Hong Kong government and Beijing wanted Ed out of Chinese territory. Our concern was, we knew there was an extradition request coming. The US had to be very careful, because with extradition, the US could only ask for Ed's extradition for criminal offenses where there's an equivalent criminal offense in Hong Kong. They couldn't charge him with something else where there's not an equivalent offense in Hong Kong, because the extradition magistrate would say no, we're not gonna extradite him. So it was on the Saturday, the 22nd, if I'm not mistaken, of June, that the U.S. formally disclosed that they brought 3 charges of theft against Ed Snowden. He's been charged with theft. But, as John has pointed out, it was under the draconian Espionage Act, where for cases of theft, it's what we call an absolute liability offense, meaning you can't explain yourself. If it's disclosed negligently or intentionally, you're guilty. A jury would not be able to be allowed to hear that. Yes, Ed's case would be heard in eastern Virginia, which is right across from Washington, D.C., very conservative. Jurors would be expected to be sitting as jurors in that court. So our concern is Ed would be arrested. And fortunately, the U.S., and my theory is this is too many chefs in the kitchen, they made mistakes in the extradition request to the Hong Kong government. And they asked for the arrest and extradition of Edward James Snowden. Now, I don't know who Edward James Snowden is. I know who Edward Joseph Snowden is, my client. And the Hong Kong government was very cautious, very conservative, and The United States had made this request on a Saturday, Hong Kong time, where the Department of Justice is not really well staffed, and they needed time, and they had other concerns about the request they need clarifications on. So it was at that point where I advised Ed, okay, what do you want to do? Ed wanted to go. And his plans were to go to Ecuador, South America. And he was able to get on he was able to check in, go through immigration, and get on the flight. There was a group of lawyers at the airport. I drove with Ed to the airport, and my instructing solicitor at the time, Jonathan Mann, he was also at the airport, had bought a ticket to Shanghai, was never going to get on the flight, but was able to go through immigration to be at the boarding point for Ed in case he was stopped. So there were a lot of Hong Kong security personnel at the boarding gate. But Ed was not interfered with. He got on his flight, but as has been pointed out earlier, by the time Ed arrived in Moscow for his transit, because Ed didn't have a visa for Russia, it was just a simple transit flight, he didn't have a valid passport anymore. So that's where Ed got stuck. And fortunately, he was granted asylum by the Russian government, political asylum, for a period of time, a short period of time, and then he applied for an ordinary business visa, and since 2014, he's been on a business visa. The Russian government's rationale is that he's committed no crimes in Russia, and he's an ordinary businessman. And Ed's the director of the Freedom Press Foundation. As for Hong Kong, many people asked about myself and the Snowden refugees, did you not commit crimes aiding and abetting Mr. Snowden? Well, while Mr. Snowden was in Hong Kong, he was lawfully there, he had a visa, and he had not committed any criminal offenses in Hong Kong, and the extradition request was not perfected. So he was not considered a fugitive under Hong Kong law. So everything was lawful. And Mr. Snowden was aware of that. I explained to Mr. Snowden, once there's an extradition request, if it's perfected, then you can no longer stay with the Snowden refugee families because you'd be putting them at risk. And again, it would have been the Snowden refugees' choices to continue to help Mr. Snowden or not. But Mr. Snowden was very clear. He didn't want to hurt anybody. But fortunately, Mr. Snowden was never a fugitive in Hong Kong territory. And a lot of people ask me that today. So, sorry. Right. This quote, this is what Ed said in the film Citizen 4, in the hands of a system whose reach is unlimited but whose safeguards are not. You're not just seeing that with electronic mass surveillance and how the government's using this data. You're seeing it right across society, how it's affecting our fundamental rights and freedoms. And it's also affecting how we behave. Since these revelations, people are no longer exercising their fundamental rights, such as freedom of expression, association, assembly, mobility, religious rights, because freedom of religion involves congregating and practicing your religious beliefs. So people have constrained themselves and are no longer exercising their rights fully. And at the same time, when they do speak out, there's retribution. There's a penalty to be paid. Now, the whistleblowers, and I agree with what's said here today, the whistleblowers, if you step forward and make that decision of conscience, and it is a decision of conscience, it's not for profit, it's not for fame, it's something that's a very careful decision reached by an individual to step forward and to take that enormous step. And this was a huge step for Mr. Snowden, and he understood clearly that his life was going to change. For example, one of the first things I did is I wanted to understand if Ed was of sound mind. By the way, I receive requests all the time from people who say they're whistleblowers or they want to whistleblow, but a lot of the people who contact me are mentally ill. They're people who are compromised in some way. And but no, Ed was of completely clear mind, and it was an enormous decision. Now, what I wanted to do is just go through, just to give you context of where we are today. Because my view is, I think society in general is in denial of where we are in terms of government and society. We really are turning a blind eye to the realities here. And we're really looking at governments today. And Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, he was very critical of what was going on with governments around the world. And being very critical of democracies becoming more authoritarian. And I'm going to bring this to, there we go. I'll let you read that. And he contrasts the way democratically elected leaders are behaving to the way Mandela had conducted himself in South Africa. And he's very critical, also contrasting or comparing current leaders today in so many countries on how they're behaving, how they're using their powers, how they're abusing their powers and committing human rights abuses, and trying to keep their powers to other leaders who were democratically elected in the past. And he's simply saying, what you're doing, there's nothing special about it, it's nothing new, it's been done before, and the consequences are tragic, catastrophic for civilians and the most vulnerable in our society, and they will be, your legacy will not be a Mandela-style legacy. The current High Commissioner for, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, she talks about, and this is about a year after Zaid Hussein made these statements. And by the way, these statements are all published on the internet. They're all part of the UN High Commissioner's reports and also Special Rapporteur's reports. In my view, what the UN people are doing and the Special Rapporteurs is they're actually publishing. They're doing a similar job to what journalists do. And this is the kind of information that mainstream media, most media, is just ignoring. I've handed out these reports to mainstream journalists, and they take them and they're excited, but 15, 20 pages, single space, they don't read them, they don't report on them. So it's a real task as a lawyer to try to crystallize important points in these reports. And I'm going to be touching upon the role of the UN Special Rapporteurs and the consequences to them globally under the current environment. But the one thing I found interesting what Michelle Bachelet said here is she talks about how the threats to us and the abuses that are happening in societies around the world and democracies are related to technological developments. And we can see that with the disclosures that Snowden made and the consequential results of gross inequalities. And what we have, and this is what the UN High Commissioner is saying, is you have people who are saying, look, there are all these injustices today, and we're seeking justices and truth, justice and truth. And what the government is doing in response is they're trying to shut these people down. So really, you have a vicious cycle today, and it's escalating to a point where, as one gentleman mentioned, he was a teacher who's having problems, and this, I'm not sure your name? Jane, had made disclosures about egregious criminal conduct here in the UK, and there's a price to pay for that when there shouldn't be a price to pay for that. Okay? And one thing that Ed Snowden's talked about, and I've talked about in the past, is that when you go up against government and institutions, let's say you point out an individual, you're not just pointing out that institution or individual, you're pointing out everybody who was in that institution, who was aware of what was going on, or is aware that it happened in the past, and they may be implicated. So they tend to entrench themselves in there and fight back. Okay. Oops. And Bachelet talks about, this disparity between those who have power and those who are looking for justice and truth, and how governments today are increasingly using criminal, violent tactics and actions to shut people down, to shut dissent down. Manfred Nowak, he was the UN Special Rapporteur for Torture up until 2010, and basically his view, and I do agree with him, is that those who are elected in democracies today, they are once in power attacking the democratic institutions they're in to gain a grip on power. And you're seeing that in countries all over the world. Democracies, from the United States, with what Mr. Trump is doing and continues to do, to countries in Europe, like Austria, Denmark, Hungary. I mean, just egregious conduct, horrific conduct. And Nowak, Nowak has emphasized that human rights have never been at such a low point since World War II. Now, this is an individual who walked into countries like Sri Lanka before the end of the Civil War in 2009 and after the Civil War, you know, and firsthand have gone into, or has tried to get into, prisons, military camps, trying to find out what was going on. Now, there's this issue about the media, mainstream media, alternative media. As a human rights lawyer, I rely on what the UN Special Rapporteurs talk about. I'm very, very skeptical about what the media has to say, because a lot of the times the media doesn't get it right. They don't put in the full context. They don't put in the full facts. There's not enough there. So in most of my work, I rely heavily on the extraordinary work that the UN Special Rapporteurs do. I just want to briefly, you know, to have a wider context that, you know, we're also seeing, you know, core or key participants in democracy, such as lawyers, journalists, activists, NGOs, also being targeted. And also what you're seeing is you're seeing mainstream media ignoring what a lot of people have to say. You're seeing the disintegration of media, particularly in smaller towns, rural areas. You're also seeing an erosion of investigative journalism. What you're seeing is you're seeing news coming on Facebook, YouTube stars, and that's where the advertising's going. That's where the money's going. And the loss is to the average person in society. So once you lose the investigative journalism, the local journalism, then you lose transparency and accountability in local communities and in cities. And I just want to mention that it's not just the surveillance state today, it's the corporation. And we've all seen what Facebook's been doing, and basically Facebook efforts to hold Facebook accountable. And it doesn't seem to be, there seems to be some progress, but not much progress in my view. But how corporations are using internet platforms, media platforms, to obtain our data, to use that data, not just to, you know, design systems where they could predict what's going to happen, but to manipulate. And really what's happening is we're just giving away our data without thinking. The corporation's taking our data without much ethical consideration and using that to manipulate our behavior. And we're really moving into an environment where there's job opportunities. It's a unique environment with a lot of opportunities for people, but there's a trade-off here. And I don't think that we're really putting our minds to what we're doing to ourselves. And I think we're caught way behind technology. And we may be 2-3 steps behind technology and what the impact is on our societies and on individuals. So I just wanted to briefly mention that. Now I want to mention apathy. Noam Chomsky stated recently, all over the place, I'll read this out, all over the place, from popular culture to the propaganda system, there is constant pressure to make people feel that they are helpless, that the only role that they can have is to ratify decisions and to consume. Now, I've spoken to a lot of young people, late teens, university students today, and the message I'm getting from a lot of students is this is beyond us. There's this hopelessness they have. You know, how can we change the system? And that's something I'll discuss at the very end of this talk. But preempting to some extent, what I'm going to say, the whistleblowers move forward, doing the right things. The legal test is disclosure in the public interest of egregious criminal conduct of government or corporations, or concealment in the public interest. Okay, and clearly for John, my client, Mr. Snowden, the public interest of the American government, Five Eyes, egregious criminal conduct far outweighed any public interest for concealment, right? So these individuals step forward, and it's a very lonely place to be. And as I mentioned earlier, my clients, the Snowden refugees, helped Mr. Snowden. They've paid a heavy price. I'll touch upon that shortly. Myself, I paid a heavy price. Okay, and but the question is why is society not stepping forward in the masses? Okay, this is a fantastic venue today. There's less than 100 people here. I've spoken at other conferences where there's thousands of people. There'd be people lining up at the door. So my question is, you know, what are we doing today? Why are we not stepping forward and supporting the whistleblowers of this world? You know, when nobody steps forward, in a sense, it's a betrayal. It's a betrayal to society that, look, here is egregious criminal conduct being exposed, but everybody's just saying, okay, that's nice, it's entertaining, but I'm not going to get involved. I don't want to get into trouble. I don't want to take a stand. And it's very hard for that lone individual to step forward. It's a very hard place to be, as we've heard today. All right. I'm going to do this very quickly. What's happening, and I'm going to go into the law, is you're seeing an erosion of fundamental rights and under international law, constitutional law, globally. Okay? Sami al-Saadi, February 2004, a Libyan national, was transiting through Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong government detained him at the Hong Kong airport. The British and US government officials were at the airport. They detained him, his wife, and his 2 children, and put them on a rendition flight. He had no access to a lawyer. He was not able to raise any refugee or asylum claims. He was simply put on a rendition flight with the assistance of the Hong Kong government. So looking at Edward Snowden's arrival 9 years later, I was I was acutely aware that the same thing could happen. Okay, and I've mentioned Ed here in 2013 because that was almost a certainty that if the Hong Kong government could do it, if the US government on their own could grab Mr. Snowden, he'd disappear. The Hong Kong booksellers in 2015, they disappeared from Hong Kong and Thailand, and they reappeared in mainland China. The Snowden refugees, the Sri Lankan police in December 2016 flew into Hong Kong hunting my clients right after Christmas, okay, looking for all 7 Snowden refugees, simply because of their association with Mr. Snowden. And the police wouldn't take up the complaint. They delayed 4 months. And when they did meet with the Snowden refugees, and I was present, they just wanted to know about Mr. Snowden, and they weren't interested in making a case against the Sri Lankan police. And by the way, China, mainland China, is the biggest arms supplier to Sri Lanka and a big investor in Sri Lanka. And Xiao Jianhua, early 2017, he was at the Four Seasons Hotel in Hong Kong, which is a Canadian chain. There were mainland Chinese agents who came in and just grabbed them, and he disappeared in mainland China. The Uyghurs in 2015 in Thailand, Uyghurs from northwestern China, found their way into Thailand seeking refuge, and they were just sent back to China. And the Prime Minister, military man, stated that it was not Bangkok's fault if they had problems. That's not the legal test. You know, it's not the legal test to send somebody to another jurisdiction. In 2019, and I'm not surprised, now you have concentration camps in mainland China, 1 million people locked up. And what is the world doing? Really nothing. You know, everybody's doing well here in the West, and so there's 1 million people locked up for no reason. Men, women, children. Right, I'd like to just briefly talk about the international law structure. So this will be a bit academic. I'll do this quickly. There are conventions, but there's also customary international law, where certain convention prohibitions also exist without a convention. Okay, so most international crimes, like genocide, war crimes, that exists without any convention. It exists because every country in the world, or most countries in the world, recognize that these are things that should not be done. Now I want to go into Article 33 of the Refugee Convention. And this is the protection for anybody, anywhere in the world, if they have a well-founded fear of persecution. Okay? That no state they enter into should expel them or refouler. Okay? Not to refoul. A refugee in any manner whatsoever on the frontiers of territories where his life or freedom would be threatened. Now, life and freedom also includes any serious harm. Okay? On account of his race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Okay? Now, there's an exception here, okay, if you've committed a very serious crime or you're a threat to state security. Okay? So if somebody wants to seek refugee status in the UK and they've been convicted of murder in another country, they'll be recognized as a refugee, but then that will be stripped from them because they committed a very serious crime. Okay? Okay, and this is what I've just discussed here. And it's a forward-looking test. You don't have to have lost your liberty or, ill-treated or tortured or an attempt on your life. It's forward-looking. And typically, a refugee lawyer will say, okay, who's similarly placed to you as examples of, what would happen to you if you went back to your home country. And you have an obligation to seek state protection in your country unless you're unable to or you're unwilling. And in a lot of countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, you're not going to go to the police if the government's coming after you. Okay, it's just futile to do so because of corruption. And I'm going to focus on political opinion and social group. For Mr. Snowden, his claims were based on political opinion. Now, the one thing about political opinion is it connects to freedom of expression, and as I mentioned earlier, fundamental rights of association, assembly, and mobility. Okay? And the reason why I say that is because for persecution, it's not the person being persecuted what their opinion is. Okay? It's the perception by the persecutor. Okay? So for example, I have clients who have no political opinion, no political affiliation, but they happen to be standing beside some politician, opposition politician on the street, and the ruling party saw my client standing near that person and assumed, okay, that person's supporting the opposition, let's go after that person. So it's all about the perception of the persecutor. Now for the Snowden refugees, they helped Mr. Snowden. Okay? And they've been persecuted simply because they associated with him. Okay? Subsequently, they've spoken out saying, yes, they support him. Okay? But it was just enough for them just to say, look, you can stay here. For the persecutors, the Sri Lankan government and the Hong Kong government, to go after them. Now, social group is what the Snowden refugees are. Okay. Now you saw in Article 33 that there's a social group category, and it's an open-ended category. And basically, the Snowden refugees, and you can see by the definition here, UN definition, is that they did something, a decision of conscience, in the past, of historical significance, but it's an inalienable part of who they are, the decisions they made. And society recognizes that they are a group. So they've been persecuted by the Hong Kong government and the Sri Lankan authorities simply because of the decision they made to help Mr. Snowden. Okay. Now I want to mention the Torture Convention, which is mentioned here earlier. Okay. Simply put, the definition of torture is severe physical or psychological pain and suffering if somebody applies that to you. And it could be in any form, from sleep deprivation to waterboarding to being held by chains, being put in fixed positions where you can never relax or never be comfortable, and you suffer. It's a non-derogable absolute right. Nobody could ever extradite you or remove you from the jurisdiction if there's a substantial grounds to believe that you will be tortured. You can't torture somebody a little bit. And the United States government just flagrantly ignored international law. The US is not a signatory, by the way, to the Torture Convention. And Article 7 of the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights says there should be no ill treatment and torture. Ill treatment is cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Now, if you're rejected on your refugee claim because you're somebody who committed war crimes, and the given country says, no, you have to go back to your home country, you get protection under the Torture Convention. But what countries often do is they say, look, you're not a refugee, you can't stay, but you can stay under the Torture Convention, but you can't stay in our country. We want you to find another country to stay in, okay, because of the crimes you committed. And there's another issue, a very important issue about refugees, okay? They have an absolute right to cross any border legally or illegally. And that's enshrined under Article 14 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and under Article 31 of the Refugee Convention. So governments around the world have been going on and on about, oh, these are all illegal migrants, they're economic migrants trying to, take our jobs from us. And what governments have done is they've used the media, gone through the media, using this propaganda to dilute, the rights of actual legitimate asylum seekers, legitimate refugee claimants. And this is discussed by academics globally about, basically how asylum rights are being diluted, okay? So this is an example of how governments are just very subtly stripping away asylum rights, okay? And this is part of what the UN Special Rapporteur, the UN High Commissioners for Human Rights have been talking about, how governments are using hate and xenophobia to basically get votes. Try to blame somebody, blame social groups to gain political advantage. And it's at an enormous price to the most vulnerable, those who are seeking to save their own lives. Okay, I'm going to move forward here. And you've seen these kinds of actions by the governments of Austria, Denmark, Hungary, and you see how with the Mediterranean, how so many lives have been lost, and laws are being passed or have been passed where, NGOs, volunteers going out to say, look, we're going to help you. They now could be charged with human trafficking, which is outrageous. In North America, we've all seen what Donald Trump has achieved, and it's just incredible how children have lost their lives after being separated from their families. Thailand, I've already discussed. And by the way, there are rendition and torture sites in Thailand. They've been used for many years. And for Hong Kong, there's a 0.5% acceptance rate of refugees. In the High Court, 0.5% acceptance rate in court cases. It's basically a system that's been built in Hong Kong that doesn't recognize refugees or asylum seekers. And I'm going to be going to the media in a second, okay? But before I do that, I just want to give you a quick case example of what's happened in the Philippines and the erosion of international law, okay? Over 20,000 Filipinos have been executed under the guise of a drug war, addicts in particular. Extrajudicial killings, those held in police custody, they killed, and martial law declared in Mindanao and a state of emergency across the whole country. And extraordinarily, the current president Duterte has been quoted, "If Germany had Hitler, the Philippines would have," and he pointed to himself. "Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. There's 3 million drug addicts. I'd be happy to slaughter them." Okay, and I haven't seen public outrage or global outrage with this kind of behavior. Okay, and going back to the UN Special Rapporteurs, the UN Special Rapporteur Victoria Tali Corpus, she's been threatened by the Duterte government. Okay. And what's interesting is she's the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights. Duterte has threatened to commit war crimes, or crimes against humanity, by bombing the school of ethnic minorities in Mindanao. And Agnes Calamard, she's been threatened by Duterte to be assaulted. And also the International Criminal Court prosecutor who's investigating Duterte for crimes against humanity, she's been threatened with violence and also death if she comes to the Philippines. All right. And this is all happening under the protection of the mainland Chinese government. The ICC, Duterte actually withdrew from, okay? But that doesn't prevent the International Criminal Court from prosecuting him. Mainland China apparently told Duterte that they would not let him lose power. Now, under the International Criminal Court, the permanent members of the Security Council can veto any prosecution. So the inference from that is that mainland China has given assurances to Duterte that if the ICC decides to prosecute you for war, for crimes against humanity, we'll veto that. Now the media, okay? Actually, I'd like to go back. I'm sorry about that. All right, one thing I want to mention is I've already mentioned the Snowden refugees, how they've been targeted and abused by the Hong Kong government and the Sri Lankan government. But here in the UK, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention had found that the way Assange had been treated amounted to imprisonment, okay? And the UK government would not allow Assange to go and get medical treatment. They wouldn't allow him to leave the jurisdiction. And this was contrary to international law, because Assange had asylum protection. But what is more shocking is what the current Ecuadorian president did, in that he expelled, basically kicked Assange out of the embassy without any of his due process rights being afforded to him. He was simply given notice an hour or so before that you're going to be thrown out of the embassy. And so the Ecuadorian government violated their own constitution. That's the first thing. They didn't afford him notice to be able to reply, to go to the Ecuadorian courts and to fight. He was simply kicked out. And the excuses the Ecuadorian government gave were basically nonsensical. The second thing is, he had asylum, and everybody understood that him being pushed out of the Ecuadorian embassy would result in his extradition to the United States. Okay? And we call that chain refoulement. right? So the Ecuadorian government had an obligation to look at what the consequences were if he was sent to the United States, and they didn't do that. All they did is they asked the UK to give assurances he'd be treated fairly. Okay, so the Ecuadorian government just outright, flagrantly disregarded Mr. Assange's asylum rights, but also his right not to be chain refouled from the Ecuadorian embassy into the UK to the United States. Now, I have a lot of positive things to say about the media, okay, in that it's really important, their role is really important to assist whistleblowers, okay? Their role is to work with whistleblowers to bring out the information, okay? But there's also obligations, and I'm increasingly seeing the failings by the media, okay, in terms of their carrying out their obligations and reporting what is accurate. And if I could get some assistance to play the video. Yeah, thanks. It'll be the, yes, that's it.
Talks about them, those that harbor, and the Snowden refugees, as the Guardian talks about them, those that harbored, that sheltered Ed Snowden to protect him in Hong Kong before he made his way out of the country, now facing possible return to Sri Lanka. Now they're appealing that decision. Very briefly, we only have a minute.
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible humanitarian story. I hope people pay attention to it. They deserve asylum not because of the random connection they had to Snowden, though they did hide him and house him during the time he was hiding in Hong Kong, but because they're refugees who face serious threats if they're returned home, and civilized countries grant asylum to people who face persecution, whether it's Edward Snowden or the refugees that are at the border now in the south of the United States, or these refugees in Hong Kong. They deserve protection.
All right, Mr. Greenwald, NYU law graduate, very well respected, got $250 million to start The Intercept after he did the reporting on Mr. Snowden. He was with Mr. Snowden for about 10 days. On the 11th of June, Glenn Greenwald was out of Hong Kong. He didn't spend much time after the report went. Okay, now what's interesting here is he said that, and Glenn never knew about, Mr. Greenwald never knew about the Snowden refugees. I've never spoken to him about the Snowden refugees. He's never been privy to their legal files. Nevertheless, Mr. Greenwald made the following statements: that they deserve refugee protection, but not because of their random connection to Mr. Snowden. Number one, it wasn't a random connection. Number two, even if it is a random connection, it's irrelevant. A connection is a connection. It could be de minimis, it could be significant. And he admits he sheltered them. My client sheltered Mr. Snowden. It is the perception of the persecutor. So Mr. Greenwald got the law completely wrong. And he's a lawyer. He professes to be knowledgeable on constitutional law, but he got it wrong. Okay? So, what Mr. Greenwald, reported was wrong in law, inaccurate, and it also was completely contrary to the basis of the refugee claims of the Snowden refugees. And he did that on Democracy Now! And so it's this type of responsibility that reporters have, the media have, to get the law correct, to get the facts correct, and not to report something like that. Okay, Mr. Greenwald also failed to understand that under the Refugee Convention, the Snowden refugees form a social group. The Snowden refugees, there's only 7 in the world. So that's why I said earlier, I tend to rely more on the reports of the UN Special Rapporteurs and researchers who go into these countries to get more reliable, credible data. And I'm very skeptical about what's happening. And what's disappointing is The Intercept holds itself out as being responsible, journalist-responsible reporting. And unfortunately, Mr. Greenwald said things that weren't accurate. So I think this also creates false news, erroneous information going out into the public, and confusion. Okay. Now, what I'd like to do is, I'm going to need your assistance again. Okay. Oops, sorry. All right, Snowden refugees. Okay, so these are the individuals who basically saved Mr. Snowden's life. Vanessa and her little girl at the bottom on the left. She's from the Philippines. Her daughter is born in Hong Kong, stateless. The gentleman above the little girl, Kiana, is from Sri Lanka. He's a former military, horrifically tortured. Vanessa on the left was human trafficked. The woman on the right is Nadika and her partner, Sapun, and their 2 children. And they suffered, the women suffered gender persecution, and the men basically suffered political persecution. And, all right, so there's a second video. If we can start that. So finally, after 7 years, the first of the Snowden refugees arrived in Hong Kong. And that was Vanessa and her daughter, and that was on the 25th of March. Yeah, that's it. So after 7 years of fighting for Vanessa and her daughter Kiana, she's finally ready to go.
Now I'm safe and free, and I'm so grateful.
They knew what it was like. To be hunted, to be chased, to be retaliated against. And they smiled at me. You know, they opened their home. It was very small. They were living in very difficult conditions, you know, in incredible poverty. And they shared everything they had.
We are, though, very concerned that the other families have been left behind. And we would like to see Mr. Trudeau and his government take necessary steps to decide the cases now. All right, so this is at Pearson International Airport in Toronto after 7 years. And what's interesting is the father of Kiana, on the far left, is the father of the other 2 children, Satamdi and Dinath, the other Snowden refugee family. And this is Kiana here with her dad. This was the day before she was leaving for Canada. And this was the last time they've seen each other. And for reasons unknown, the Canadian government decided just to bring in little Kiana and her mom and to split up the family. So this little girl may never see her father ever again, or her half-brother and half-sister. And the only way they communicate now is through encrypted means on a cell phone, and that's the closest that the relationship is, and that may be the closest it ever is, unless this family gets removed. And so the cases of the other 5, the soldier and this family of 4, are still pending. Okay, and they're at risk of being deported to Sri Lanka right now. So the Canadian government knows, under UN guidelines, that it doesn't matter if you're married or not, it doesn't matter if they're your half-brother, half-sister, families are never to be separated and divided. But for reasons unknown, the Canadian government decided to split this family in 2, and this is turning into a humanitarian disaster. All right, I'm going to leave it there, but what's happening today is Mr. Assange had his asylum stripped from him. Okay, you have countries that are not letting asylum seekers, whistleblowers, cross borders. Mr. Snowden got stuck in Russia. Okay, they're violating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the refugee conventions. The United States, as John pointed out, systematically, use torture, which is endemic part of how it operates. Okay, and you're seeing countries like Ecuador, the way they stripped Mr. Assange was not to afford him due process or constitutional rights. So it's no longer a Guantanamo-based situation. It's going mainstream. Okay. By the way, the Hong Kong government, in legislation, states there's no such thing as a refugee. There's no such thing as an asylum seeker. They're all illegal immigrants. Okay. And that's what's happening in countries like Austria and Denmark today. So I raise all of this today, okay, because for whistleblowers in the future, I agree with John. First thing you do is get a lawyer, okay? A lawyer who knows exactly what they're doing, who understands the legal avenues and consequences, okay? That's the first thing. And to get that legal advice, okay? My view, my strong view is that there are failings, societal failings, where people lack the education, despite having enormous amounts of information, and they lack the education and ethics to be able to operate in today's world. People are focused on whatever they're doing and they're not thinking about the consequences of what's going on. Anyways, if you have any questions, I don't know if there's time for any questions.
Could we just have 2 questions?
You mentioned Glenn Greenwell.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that he got $250 million.
Quarter billion.
$250 million.
Yeah, the Intercept was given $250 million.
From whom?
Former...
Pierre Omidyar,
yeah.
the founder of eBay.
For him to
have a newspaper.
Have a newspaper. So, and what's happened to all the Snowden papers? Because he's got them.
The Snowden archives, Glenn, if I'm not mistaken, recently, the Interceptor, or the group that Glenn's with, they don't want to continue the Snowden archives. Why? So, apparently financial reasons.
They said it was too expensive and too labor-intensive to allow free access to them. So a couple of weeks ago, they just closed them off.
Well, why didn't they give them to academics around the world to investigate?
Apparently, that's what Glenn is saying. That's what they're saying they're trying to do. But
if they gave him this big bunch of money, what happened to it all?
This is not exactly a transparent process, from what I can see. So I have no idea.
So he's just rich and having fun, right?
I don't want to say I don't know I don't want to go that far. All I'm saying is
I'm joking.
I'm saying is that you know, it's in limbo. It's unknown what's going to happen.
So they've closed it off, and that's the end. We just sit here and say, "Oh, too bad."
Well, that's up to everybody in society. It's
and
up
what
to
does Mr. Snowden say?
I'm not going to go into that discussion,
Okay.
but it's really in the hands. It's really in the hands of Glenn Greenwald and the group that's holding on to the archives right now.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for your presentation and for reminding us about the Snowden story, which is an absolutely extraordinary story, and the people who've put themselves at risk. And you are right to emphasise the plight of the Snowden refugees who have been sort of, if not forgotten and not emphasised enough in this. I wondered if we could also just remember the contribution of another person who Edward Snowden has called the bravest woman alive, who escorted Snowden through the airport in Hong Kong, onto the flight, that terrifying stop before the flight took off, and they didn't quite know what was going on, and then stayed with Snowden for 40 days in Sheremetyevo Airport, helped him submit over 20 asylum claims before they submitted the successful asylum claim in Russia, and then stayed with him for 3 months in Moscow, found herself unable to come back to the UK for 2 whole years while she was at threat of being stopped under the Terrorism Act. And that is, of course, Sarah Harrison. And I wonder if we could just sort of remember her contribution, which is incredibly important.
Mr. Snowden's grateful for that, obviously, but please remember that the Snowden refugees have been living in exile since the early 2000s, and they've suffered. They've suffered for the last 3 years for helping Mr. Snowden.
I appreciate you raising that case, as I said.
And by the way, as the lawyer and all the lawyers who worked on this case, it was all pro bono. There's no money. You know, and I was pretty much chased out of Hong Kong. I still practice. I'm still fighting for the other families. But yes, there were key times and key people who did their part and Sarah did an extraordinary thing to help Mr. Snowden at the airport with Jonathan Mann and myself. And she did a great job in Russia helping Mr. Snowden.
One final question.
It's not actually a question. I just wanted to. I noticed that you mentioned the Uyghur population in Xinjiang.
Yes.
It's more. I think the recent estimate's more like 3 million in the internment camp. So I just thought I'd say that just to update you.
When did you get the update?
Last night. I was at an event
3
last
million.
night. So.
And still no global outrage.
Yeah.
So what was the question? We couldn't hear.
No, this gentleman pointed out that the number of Uyghur ethnic minorities, the number's 3 million as of last night, right? Yeah.
I understand your faith and belief in the legal system to reach just decisions, but when you look at places like the United States, where the courts now are being loaded with conservative judges who are going to make particular decisions, the notion of justice through legality may not be that good, really.
I mean, there's the principle of wicked laws and wicked cases, which are completely immoral, unconscionable, but legal. And I never said that I believe in the justice system. I mean, in fact, Hong Kong, when you have a 0.5% acceptance rate for refugees, and by the way, Vanessa and Kiana, their cases were completely rejected by the Hong Kong authorities, and Canada disagreed. I mean, that exposes a justice system in Hong Kong that is compromised, and it's very unfortunate. So for a refugee community, there are such manifest injustices at all levels of the system affecting refugees, including the justice system.
Everyone except for Robert has written books on these topics, and I've read many of them, and they're fantastic books. And this is, Andrew's got some on sale at the end, but I highly recommend those interested that, it's one way of spreading the word about whistleblowing and the importance, and subverting the media possibly by reading books. But
That's right, yes. Hello, hi. Well, my name is Andrew Fowler, and look, I thought I'd just tell you a bit about myself to start off with. I'm the author of not only that excellent book, but a Julian Assange title called The Most Dangerous Man in the World. I was reporter for the Australian version of Panorama, Four Corners, and a foreign correspondent for nearly 20 years. Before that, in the 1980s, for a short time, I was chief of staff of the Australian newspaper in Australia, which is a Murdoch-owned newspaper. A short time before I ran screaming from the building. I started out in journalism as a reporter on a very small weekly newspaper called the Mid-Sussex Times in Haywards Heath, and then I worked for several provincial newspapers before finally joining the London Evening News, and then I migrated to Australia in 1976. My latest book, published there, Criminalising Journalism, I suppose has a self-explanatory title, which is what brings me here today. It's the criminalising of journalism. And please excuse my voice. I had quite a heavy night last night with people I'm not allowed to mention. Okay, now the seriousness of all this, of course, is that when the Metropolitan Police dragged, which is what they did, and you saw those appalling pictures of Julian being dragged from the Ecuador Embassy in London last month, we were witnessing the physical representation of what governments in the West have been attempting to do to journalism, particularly since 9/11, that is, to silence it, to control it, I suppose, in fact, to criminalise it. From the moment Assange and WikiLeaks revealed the atrocities being committed by the US in Iraq and Afghanistan, remember the gunship video Collateral Murder? He was a marked man. But it was not that, or even, in my opinion, the 250,000 US State Department cables which lifted the veil on the thinking behind US diplomacy, or even the Gitmo papers, which told us so much about the US use of torture at Guantanamo Bay, released by WikiLeaks in April 2011, which reignited the desire to file for his extradition. What really, in my opinion, and the opinion of others as well, ignited the anger of the Americans was the WikiLeaks release of the so-called Vault 7 documents in April 2017, which detailed how the CIA could illegally spy on anyone, anywhere, at any time, turning a telephone into a transmitter or a humble domestic TV into a listening device. The systems the CIA were perfecting would also render phone encryption, that is Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, all the stuff that we use to communicate with each other to avoid the police and authorities from tracking the sources we're talking to, would render that completely useless. Some of the documents even suggested the CIA might be able to interfere with a car's electronic system and cause it to crash. The perfect, near untraceable assassination weapon. 1 month after the release of Vault 7, the then director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, launched a direct attack on WikiLeaks work, calling the organisation a, quote, hostile intelligence service. Now, with a bombastic bully, just 3 months in the White House, it was a signal that any opposition to the hegemonic power of the United States would be crushed. So much for the notion that the intelligence agencies could in any way be held accountable, even after all the revelations by Edward Snowden, which were at first scorned by the Obama White House and later accepted as raising major concerns. The notion of accountability had been shown up for what it is, an illusion. It was business as usual where the oversight of the intelligence agencies was near impossible. Now just recently, I think just yesterday, or the day before, the latest example revealed how MI5 made serious breaches of the Investigatory Powers Act, but we only know about that because MI5 self-reported. They self-reported that they breached the Act. If they hadn't self-reported, we wouldn't have known about it. And the more journalists investigate these kind of misdeeds, the greater threat they face. And this is the great paradox. It is that the state has the power to become more intrusive, and as it becomes more intrusive, the necessity to check that power becomes more acute, and at the same time, more difficult. Exposing the systems being utilised to monitor journalists is seen as a direct assault on the agencies, who are far more powerful than the journalists who are exposing them. In the case of WikiLeaks and Assange, it appears struggled to the death. I think that's not too strong a statement to make. Faced with this kind of attack, one might expect that journalists in particular would be up in arms. I mean, for example, in the 1970s, Duncan Campbell discovered that GCHQ was up to no good. He exposed the listening devices that they had, the systems of surveillance that they were operating around the world, and he revealed it, and the public rightly believed that they had the right to know about this. He published. His work was widely supported by other journalists, although there were, of course, some dissenting voices, and there always are. But Campbell, like Assange, was not a member of the so-called mainstream media. He worked for Time Out, a magazine which I think is still going, but his stories, like WikiLeaks, were republished by the mainstream press. So the question is, why aren't journalists taken to the streets in their thousands to confront this most recent threat to their existence? It's difficult to define exactly what it is, but it appears to be a strange kind of elitism, a kind of snobbery. Working with the words, it's difficult to singularly define it, but it has certainly invaded journalism. Now, its arrival seems to be coupled with the emergence of what you might call celebrity journalism. Exactly when that started is difficult to say, but let's go back to Watergate. The Watergate reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, they may have marked the beginning of this cult. The Hollywood film All the President's Men, starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, underscored the phenomena. It's strangely ironic that the high watermark of investigative journalism at the time, which helped bring down the US president, possibly marked the beginning of this slide towards elitism and snobbery. Now, right now, journalists very often see themselves not so much as holding truth to power, but being part of the powerful. It would be easy to paint those journalists as being exclusively on the right wing of politics, if you like, but it's not that simple. Many of those in the political centre also have reservations about dealing with the more assertive journalism championed by WikiLeaks. Whatever the reason for this phenomena, it's dangerous territory for all of us. It's dangerous territory, particularly for journalists. The insults thrown by Donald Trump that journalists were the enemy of the American people might have been self-serving, but the old notion that they were undoubtedly mainly with the American people against the ruling elites was certainly something of the past. Just as the political parties had shifted to the right, abandoning the working classes, so too had many journalists. And that's not to say that all journalists in the past were shoulder to shoulder with the great masses, with the masses of working class people in any country. But they certainly had a leaning towards that, social justice issues. Those social justice issues have very much been eroded in the contemporary thinking of defining journalism, in my opinion. So what so enrages these journalistic elites is the challenge from those who question their power. Imagine that. Journalists are rather upset about having their power challenged. And few other attack that power more than Julian Assange, whose WikiLeaks organisation exposed government wrongdoing and duplicity, not just in the United States, but also in Kenya, from Australia, the UK, and to even Albania. So it's not just the US that gets it in the neck, although that's very often the current narrative that's run. It is, by the way, hardly surprising that much of the WikiLeaks material involves the US and heads up the biggest intelligence gathering operation in history, and together with the Five Eyes countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the UK. With France, by the way, now more or less an ad hoc member of this, so it's really the Six Eyes, if you like, dominate world trade and power, despite the rise of China, and Russia is an incidental afterthought in all this. We're talking about, this is the big league we're talking about here. These are the heavy hitters. These are the major industrial countries in the world. The cleaving of the relationship between journalists and their readers, and therefore their sources, that's their sources. So there's a gap opening up too in trust, not only between the readership and journalists, but also between sources and journalists, as my friend here illustrated earlier. It turned two of the most significant whistleblowers in the history of journalism away from the traditional media. Edward Snowden, who worked as a US contractor for the National Security Agency, contacted a freelance journalist, Glenn Greenwald, to get his story out. And US Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning turned to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, which published a huge number of stories which led to the Arab Spring and exposed all sorts of other stories which we know so much about. Now, why, one of the most critical words in the English language for journalists to remember, why did Snowden and Manning turn away from the traditional media? It was the timidity of the New York Times to publish an earlier story on the US National Security Agency, a mixture of fear of reader backlash if they printed the story in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the desire to please the US government that lost it, the Snowden revelations. And of course, the editorial leaders of the New York Times now quite publicly say, my God, we wish we hadn't done that. We wish we could rewind history. We really wanted those documents, but they didn't get them. Now, Snowden thought the New York Times could not be trusted. The New York Times could not be trusted. Imagine that. The publishers of the Pentagon Papers could not be trusted. In Manning's case, she was rebuffed by both the New York Times and the Washington Post before turning to WikiLeaks. Maybe something else troubled the born-to-rule journalists. While the whistleblowers shone a bright light on the unhealthy proximity to power of the mainstream media, Assange, an outsider and an Australian, that's two hits, right, against you, as well, laid the path for the future of journalism, where journalists would be expected to not only step away from powerful interests, but get much closer to the people they were supposed to serve their readers. His model demanded that journalists produce primary source evidence wherever possible, and horror of all horrors, share it with the public. Can you imagine what an awful, awful attack that is on the rather cosy, self-serving, self-satisfied attitudes of many journalists? They would be horrified to actually have to be accountable at that level. When I worked at Four Corners, which is the Panorama program, TV program, investigative journalism, I was working there several years ago, and when somebody would ring up and ask for a copy of that evening's program in transcript, the first question is, why do you want it? Because it might be a lawyer on the phone. It could be somebody who might be trying to pick an argument with you. You could just say, well, I'm sorry, you'll have to put it in writing or whatever it is, and you'd hang up on them. But now, today, that stuff is out on the web as the program goes to air. That is a direct result of what Assange and WikiLeaks did. They changed the face of journalism. Another reason why he is unforgiven by many journalists. Now, the internet made all this possible, but those who were holding out against the inevitable rise of this new form of communication posed, as I said, a great threat to their old order. Assange was not interested in off-the-record briefings from government insiders. He wanted the original documents to practice what he called then scientific journalism. His style of operation, where it worked with traditional media titles like The Guardian, New York Times, and Der Spiegel, and Le Monde in collaborative journalistic endeavours. And it spawned a host of similar operations, most notably the International Consortium of Journalists, significant work, the Panama Papers. It's easy and for some convenient to forget how much in journalism was changed by the arrival of WikiLeaks. And I was going to go through a list of the great stories that they broke, but I think we'll just press on with other details here. Despite all the, at the time after much of WikiLeaks stuff was out there in the public domain, the hysterical attacks from the United States, including a description by former Vice President and Democratic nominee hopeful Joe Biden that Assange was a high-tech terrorist. No one, this is another can answer laid for you here this evening, no one was killed as a result of WikiLeaks exposures. How do we know that? Well, it's a hard ask, but let's say the US Defense Secretary at the time, Robert Gates, somebody who may have had a bit of a vested interest in digging up a few bodies and claiming that they were WikiLeaks, admitted this when the Murdoch press, in fact, the London Times, free at your hotel, by the way, if you want it, wherever you're staying, free on railway station, free everywhere. I wonder why that is. It's free because they boost the circulation by claiming to actually have more readers than they do. That's, by the way, it's another sort of personal issue. Sorry to raise that with you at this moment. But London Times, they're out there doing the job of great journalists. They're trying to find at least one dead body to drop on Julian's doorstep. In their haste for a gotcha moment, they did report a death, but later had to apologise. The person had been dead way before the WikiLeaks disclosures. I mean, how disgraceful is that? How can you go to work the next day as a journalist and sit down and not be absolutely ashamed of yourself in being driven to, if not fabricate a story, not check it sufficiently, just because it appeals to the editorial line of your master? That's terrible. I mean, it's just shocking journalism. I don't know the name of the poor reporter that wrote that, but I do hope he's not working in journalism anymore. He probably is. Anyway, look, the Obama Justice Department looked closely at prosecuting WikiLeaks, even establishing a grand jury in December 2010. And this is another thing Assange was saying. They've got a grand jury going, and they're saying, no, it's not true. No, he was right, and he's infuriatingly, another problem he has with journalists, infuriatingly right. This is the problem. So, shortly after the release of what was known as Cablegate, then they set up the grand jury, which showed communication between US embassies and the State Department, but they fought shy of prosecution. It's an important point, because it would seem the only evidence they had was that Assange may have tried, and by the way we now know, failed, to help Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, hide her identity when she accessed classified files. Only now in this charge being brought against Assange, how Assange, confined to the Ecuador embassy, could, as Jeff Sessions said, be a priority number one for prosecution, or as I said before, or Pompeo could say he ran a hostile intelligence service, stretches credulity even in the hyperbolic world of Donald Trump. Even so, the US is out to get Assange and punish him more harshly than the 5 years he could have expected if extradited to face his current charges in the US. And the significance of his arrest means, what is significance to his arrest means to journalists cannot be, or should not be, underestimated. In the light of this, what's happened in Australia, the country of Assange's birth and citizenship, is extremely disturbing. In what can only be described as an extraordinary event, one of the country's most celebrated journalists, Peter Grester, who works as a reporter for Al Jazeera, turned on
Assange. Grester, who was charged with aiding a terrorist group by the Egyptian government and was only freed from prison by a campaign run by journalists, attempted to strip Assange of his journalistic protection, writing that he was not a journalist because he published some material which named US sources in Afghanistan. Now, I put it to you, it's a big jump from that to cast him to the wolves, but that's what Grester has done. Now, whether you consider WikiLeaks, Afghan war reporting, good, bad or indifferent journalism, it is still journalism. After all, even the most appalling acts of phone hacking failed to remove the News of the World's right to be described as a newspaper, although what kind of newspaper you may wish to debate. And the reporters involved in the hacking were never anything but journalists. Now, unfortunately, Grester is not alone. Many of my journalistic colleagues make the same arguments time and time again to me and repeatedly, and we still talk, and I suppose we're still friends and certainly colleagues. What they fail to appreciate, or maybe even care about, is that their assertions that Assange is not a journalist has severe consequences. While the Australian Journalists Union, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, and the UK's National Union of Journalists have issued strong statements supporting Assange and his journalism, it is significant that the Walkley Foundation, and the Walkley Foundation is not just like the Walkley Foundation, this is the Walkley Foundation. It's the Pulitzer Prize handing out organisation in Australia. It's the big one that every journalist wants to win. They are the people that gave WikiLeaks a Walkley in 2011 for its outstanding contribution to journalism. What it's done now is to say nothing about that, just to repeat they got the Walkley Award all that time ago, but it has not, it issued a carefully worded statement saying, listen to this one, this is what they issued, this is the statement. They said, the only threat to journalism would be if Assange faced more serious charges in the US. In other words, banging him up for 5 years for helping Bradley Manning, possibly if it's true, change the password, getting 5 years for doing what journalists do all the time, encouraging a leaker or a whistleblower to actually help them to release documents. That kind of crime is no problem for the Walkleys. Only if he goes to America and maybe gets caught up in the Espionage Act, which is another matter, would that be dangerous, because he'd face far more severe consequences than that. So why does all this matter? Why is it important that Assange is a journalist? Why do so many journalists denigrate him? What's going on here? Destroying WikiLeaks' support base has long been the target of the US military, and those who deny Assange's journalism are playing into their hands. The First Amendment free speech provisions of the US Constitution provide accepted protections for publishers and journalists who publish material which would otherwise make them subject to prosecution under the Espionage Act. So by arguing that Assange is not a journalist, journalists are giving ammunition to the US administration, which is on the record as wanting to prosecute Assange for espionage, a crime which carries a possible prison term of life. But it gets worse than that. And if they can prove that Assange acted deliberately to damage US national security and aid a foreign power, the death sentence. Maybe those journalists who look down their noses at WikiLeaks publishers who showed up their inadequacies in exposing grand-scale duplicity and slaughter should think again what it means to be a journalist. Yet there are few signs they understand how vulnerable they are. Australian journalists have none of the protections of the US First Amendment or various European court judgments which protect at least some of their work practices. It is tough in Europe and the US for sure, but what's happening in Australia is making revelatory journalism involving any aspect of the national security apparatus a near impossibility without breaking the law. We now know, thanks to Edward Snowden, that every mobile phone is a tracking device, every mobile phone tower is a surveillance arm of government. Internet search metadata, every time you enter a website, is stored by your telecommunications company to be retrieved at a later date. In Australia, journalists were offered a sop that their metadata, the tiny piece of electronic information generated by every communication, would not be accessed without a court warrant. We were very keen as journalists in protecting ourselves, and we did not make a strong stand to protect whistleblowers. But that sounded as though it were a concession to transparency, but it was nothing of the sort. The journalists won't know his or her records are being sought. The government will appoint a lawyer to represent them in a secret hearing. The first they may know about any legal issue is a knock on the door and an arrest warrant. Anyone who tells the journalist that there's an inquiry into their activities can be jailed for 2 years. And in some provisions of the proposed ASIO, that's the MI5 version in Australia, these are changes that are proposed, journalists can be jailed for 10 years for reporting what's known as a special intelligence operation. This is a really good one, even though the journalists may have no idea that they are reporting on the said special intelligence operation. These new laws make everyone nervous about reporting on national security, and perhaps that is what they are designed to do. Just before last Christmas, the government rushed through legislation which gave the intelligence agencies or police the right to order telecommunications companies to weaken or remove encryption services to anyone they targeted without a court warrant. The opposition Labour Party, which had been demanding some kind of judicial oversight, buckled. It's unusual, isn't it, seeing politicians buckle on these issues, and allowed the laws to pass because it feared a voter backlash if there were a terrorist attack during the holiday period. There we are, all done and dusted, no problems. You know, anything blows up, then we're all to blame. But if it blew up before, it'd just be our fault. I mean, this is the logic that ends us up where we are today. Tougher and tougher laws, more and more intrusion, and demanded by the intelligence agencies to protect us from terrorism. But do these dangerous intrusions into our private lives and the important work of journalists have anything to do with terrorism? As an exercise in researching my latest book, I shan't mention the title again, excuse me, I decided to try to discover just how effective mass surveillance was in stopping terrorist attacks. I examined 37 cases of terrorism against the West since 2001 in an attempt to discover the effectiveness of mass surveillance. What I discovered was that in 29 of the 37 cases I identified, from the Boston Marathon bombing to the London Bridge attacks and the Bataclan shootings in Paris, the security agencies had many of the terrorists on a watch list. That is, 3/4 of the terrorists who carried out those attacks were known to the security agencies. While the agencies were watching everyone else with mass surveillance, those they should have been watching closely got through to kill and maim with their bombs, their trucks and their knives and their guns. My findings were consistent with what the FBI reported during the investigation into the NSA's illegal spying campaign authorised by George W. Bush after the 9/11 attacks. You might recall it was called Stellar Wind. It was a story that the New York Times would not publish until way later. Excuse me. Stellar Winds. Sounds good. Excuse me. They wouldn't publish it until much later, in fact until after, the conspiracy theorists will say, after George W. Bush was re-elected. But anyway, it was until later, like a year later, and not much had changed, according to the journalist that wrote the story. Excuse me. The reason that Snowden didn't go to them when he felt the urge to go public, that's the reason. He wanted that story out. He was appalled. It took a year. Now, a declassified, heavily redacted US government report entitled Review of the Department of Justice's Involvement in the President's Surveillance Programme, originally marked Top Secret No 4, which means no foreigners, gives some insight. The report said the NSA professed to be sending out high-value information about known links to terrorism and was uncomfortable, quotes, to receive little feedback from FBI field officers other than, wait for this one, you're sending us garbage. This is the FBI telling the NSA, all this stuff you're sucking up and pumping down to us, it's not worth a cracker. It's not worth anything. What are you doing? You're wasting our time. Whereas the NSA believe the system of tippers, alerts based on metadata, contributed significantly to international terrorism investigations, none of the FBI officials and agents from the International Terrorism and Operations section, quote, could identify significant investigations to which Stellar Wind substantially contributed. The report cited 2 FBI studies which raised questions about its effectiveness in helping the FBI stop terrorist attacks. The first, from October 2001 to December 2005. I'm sorry about all the detail, but I just think, it's good to get this stuff out because it's, it's really, really, really interesting and really important to understand this. The first, from October 2001 to 2005, December, found that only 1.2%, that's not a typo, that's not 12%, right? That's 1.2% of the NSA leads made significant contributions. The second statistical study from August 2004 to January 2006 provided, quote, no examples of, quote, significant contributions to FBI counter-terrorism efforts. The report agreed with the FBI that, quote, although the information produced under Stellar Wind program had value in some counter-terrorism investigations, it played a limited role in the FBI's overall counter-terrorism efforts. Now, the UN Special Reporter on the Right to Privacy wrote in February 2017, there is little or no evidence to persuade the SRP, that's his organisation, of either the efficacy or the proportionality of some of the extremely privacy-intrusive measures that have been introduced by new surveillance laws in France, Germany, the UK and the USA. He asked if it might be less privacy-intrusive if more money was spent on human resources to carry out targeted surveillance infiltration and if less effort were expended on electronic surveillance. This in a time when the vast majority of terrorist attacks were carried out by suspects already known to the authorities prior to the attack. The UN report argued that long-term targeted surveillance and cell infiltration was seen to be far more effective than indulging in gesture politics. This guy seems to be onto something. Gesture politics. Trying to appear tough on security by legitimising largely useless, highly expensive and totally disproportionate measures which are intrusive to so many people's privacy and others' rights. Patently not the way governments should go. Or, as Edward Snowden, who I believe one day will be cited as one of the great liberators of the modern world, Snowden put it more succinctly in answer to the question, why does the NSA capture all this material? I asked him. He said, forget about terrorism completely. This is not effective for counter-terrorism. These programs never save lives. Quote, stirring up the fear of terrorism simply made it easier to get funding by arguing, quote, if you don't do this, your children will die. Exactly what the governments are using mass surveillance for is another story. It mainly involves gaining strategic and trade advantage, spying on the industrial bases of rival nations, snooping on their banking systems, doing what spies have been doing ever since spies became spies. But one thing is for sure, it has little to do with preventing terrorism. It is us, in this case, the journalists, who are terrorised, and in doing so, the ability of the Fourth Estate to play its vital role in holding government accountable is dangerously threatened, and thereby, too, is our democracy.
just a general point about the state of British newspapers at the moment in terms of the way, it's more a generic point. I was just wondering what you thought about how they reported on the Brexit issues and how they used various different narratives, including what you're talking about before, which links into the refugees and the fear of refugees. Just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
There's one thing that sells: fear. It's fear that sells. It's fear that gets your attention. And that's why immigration, migration, which has now apparently seems to have fallen off the edge of a cliff. When Nigel Farage was questioned by Andrew Marr last Sunday about that specific question, he said, "Oh, that's no longer the issue of the day." So there's a new fear, whatever that is. I mean, I haven't read the papers today, but it's fear, to answer your question as best I can, that actually motivates those story headlines, and that's really what news is in many ways. Because, just to digress a little bit on that, news is actually something which is unusual and not usual. And if we lived in a world where the news was normal, then the world would be unlivable in. It's things that are different. It's when someone's shot or someone dies or some terrible tragedy happens, that's news. The problem we have now is that we now concoct this news and we instill fear into people by raising the issue of migration instead of looking at the facts, instead of looking at the contribution, instead of dealing with it as a human being. We deal more and more as just a subject of a machine that's producing money and power for rather unsavoury characters.
Hi, I'm really glad you mentioned the Investigatory Powers Act, because I've been trying to track developments in the Act since it kind of came into being in 2014 under DREPA. Should I stand up? No. Okay. Okay, sorry. I'm Kirsty Ball from the University of St Andrews. I've been studying corporate responses to investigatory powers for quite a number of years. And I'm glad you mentioned the Investigatory Powers Act, because for me, there's been a whole bunch of developments in the Act that culminated in, I think, a diktat from Europe last November that Section 1 of the Act needed to be completely rewritten because it was completely draconian and giving public authorities and all sorts of organisations disproportionate access to metadata and communications records.
Yes.
Now, I've been trying to find any evidence that that section of the Act has been redrafted, and all I can find is a code of practice that was published in November 2018. Have I missed something? That's my question. If you're following this, have I missed something?
No, I'm glad you asked that question, because I thought I was just the stupid journo who couldn't find it. And I've been looking as well, and I can't find anything which takes it further from that November decision. It's supposed to come back here and be redrafted and then put back into the system again, right?
Yeah, that's the thing about. I think because of Brexit, I think they're just hoping the whole thing will go away. It's the same. The problem with the e-borders programme, the PNR directive, everything like that. I'm just hoping it'll be swept under the carpet. So, thanks for checking my sense.
Thank you. Thank you for reinforcing that I've done my job.
I've just got a very short, very simple question. What would you like to see Australia doing in Julian Assange's case?
Well,
Short, but not necessarily so simple.
No, I think it would be just, Julian Assange should be returned to Australia. There's no doubt about that in my mind. It's right. That's the right and decent thing to do. It's the right thing to do as somebody who's upheld the best principles of journalism. It's the right thing to do because of the immense suffering he's been put through from a humanitarian point of view as well. And it's just plainly wrong that he's been treated the way he has been treated. And all the various reports by the reporters, the UN have looked at him and, you know the story. It's so tragic. And the problem we have is how do I persuade my journalistic friends that Julian Assange is a journalist enough for them to be angry about the way he's been treated? And it's that they invest so much of their emotional baggage into dealing with Assange, and yet they're so often cold-hearted about people that they report about. And I can't quite. I try and understand this to work out why I disagree with them. I'm not too sure they spend much time worrying about why they disagree with me. Okay.
Thanks very much.